Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion number 7892 in the name of Richard Lochhead on the Common Agriculture Policy. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Richard Lochhead to speak and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate on the Common Agricultural Policy 2014 to 2020 is an opportunity for the Government to update Parliament on the state of play in the EU negotiations and our preparations here in Scotland, and of course to explain the next steps. The debate is well timed. EU-level agreement on the CAP package was confirmed only just last week. Europe still has to finish the formal adoption procedures, which will take till November or December, but the content of the deal is effectively now decided. So this is a good time for the Government to update Parliament on that deal and the implications. But before delving into the detail, we should remind ourselves of the wider context. Nearly every country treats agriculture as a unique sector, often requiring special treatment. Europe is no different. For 50 years, the CAP has supported European agriculture, initially to modernise it and recently to support its role in the environment. Here in Scotland, as we all know, CAP funding is absolutely vital. Last year's receipts from the CAP, at just under £600 million, were almost the same as net income from farming at just over £600 million. So the survival of our industry depends in many cases on a successful CAP. Now, at the start of the process, one of our priorities was to bring in new entrants and other excluded farmers to the CAP. We also wanted to clamp down on slipper farming, and we wanted sufficient coupled support to address the decline in livestock numbers. We supported greening the CAP, but we needed the details changed so as not to affect farming operations disproportionately or indeed have unintended consequences for the environment in the first place. And we wanted to remove unnecessary red tape from the proposals, and we wanted flexibility to tailor the new CAP to suit Scotland's needs. Above all, we needed the UK Government to negotiate a decent outcome for us on the budget. So, I think it's fair to say we were very successful in nearly all these priorities. We achieved changes that will put both past and future new entrants onto a level playing field. We secured the so-called Scottish clause to clamp down on slipper farmers, but we resisted an ineffective active farmer test that would have tied us up in red tape. And we did indeed get more flexibility, for example, on making sure properly farmed heather will be eligible, choosing our own timescale for phasing out historic-based payments, and also on deciding for ourselves whether to cap or reduce big individual payments, so-called degressivity. We also achieved improvements on greening. The original proposals could have caused problems for farmers without commensurate environmental benefits. And of course, we secured a much more realistic version of the greening in the final text. Indeed, based on cropping records, roughly 5,000 farmers will now be covered, but the majority are already meeting the rules. Only about 800 farmers, perhaps, will actually have to plant an additional crop under the cropping rule. So these are all achievements on Pillar 1, which is the direct payments to farmers of the policy. On Pillar 2, there was perhaps less to play for because the proposals were more for evolution as opposed to revolution. But we still secured important flexibility in several areas, perhaps most importantly on areas of natural constraint, which will replace LFAs under the new programmes. So in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, our negotiating efforts were mostly successful. However, I was disappointed with the outcome in one area, which of course is coupled support. This is the optional production-linked support, such as headage payments, to maintain types of farming in areas where it's particularly important. The original proposals put Scotland at 5% coupled support on the bottom tier of a two-tier system. In the final deal, we will have the option of now 8%, nearly double our existing coupled support under the beef scheme. But it's still a two-tier system, which I believe, and I think most farmers in Scotland believe, is fundamentally unfair. And 8% is well below the 10 to 15% that the Brian Pack inquiry recommended for Scotland.
Claire Baker.
Thank you for taking the intervention. Has the Cabinet Secretary approached the UK Government to discuss the possibility of the 8% being calculated on the UK share as opposed to just the Scottish share?
Richard Lochhead.
Yes, we have, and I'll just refer to that now because this is a key area for Scotland. And unfortunately, of course, our negotiator, Owen Patterson, didn't want any coupled support whatsoever, never mind the 5% or the 8% we finally got. And given where we have ended up, I can tell Claire Baker just asked a question that I have written to Owen Patterson asking whether the 8% limit can apply to the member state rather than to Scotland, because we've had so many mixed messages from different ministers over the last few months. But of course, that's all about damage limitation. Fundamentally, the deal on couple support remains a major disappointment for Scotland. But the deal is now done, and we must turn our attention to how to implement it. The Government has already been working on this for several years, indeed, with stakeholders. We've run workshops, had various groups, we've carried out extensive modelling, and we held a major conference just this April. As a result, there's an emerging consensus about the way forward, taking into account various concerns. One such concern is how the move to area-based payments will impact on farmers with high payments under the historic scheme that we currently have with us. For example, the more intensive beef farmers and dairy farmers are concerned about that. However, it is inevitable that their rates per hectare will come down. By definition, below average rates will rise and above average rates will fall. But there are tools we can use to mitigate the impact and hopefully manage the transition. In doing that, we have to be aware of the impact on farmers, of course, who have been excluded from the single farm payment up till now, such as the new entrants and indeed deer farmers. They have to be put in a level playing field as quickly as possible, even if we give other farmers more time to adapt. And of course, we have to keep our eye open for loopholes as well. We know people like loopholes in agricultural legislation. Already there are people thinking, no doubt, that I've got an empty hillside with some deer on it, perhaps I can qualify for big cap payments. The answer, of course, to that, incidentally, is no. But the point is there's always a minority who will try and exploit the system, and we need to be very, very aware of that. And speaking of exploiting the system, under the Scottish clause, we must find minimum activity rules that keep slipper farmers out of the system, but let genuine, extensive hill farmers into the new system. We also, of course, have to look at the actual impact of the greening measures. I do believe that greening presents a great opportunity. I want every farmer in this country to be getting more greener over time. Consumers are paying increasing attention to how their food is produced, and Scotland does indeed have a great reputation for green natural food, which we can exploit in valuable overseas markets as well as at home. But that means we do have to genuinely be green. And Scotland, while we're not the worst in the class, for instance, we don't have the extreme arable monocultures that the three-crop rule is actually aimed at tackling. We don't have that in this country. That's more other European countries. But we have to be aware at the same time that our competitors who want to be seen as green are catching up with Scotland. And we do, even in this country, do have to accept we do have some genuine environmental challenges. Our index of farmland birds, for instance, has gone down in each of the last 3 years of data. And in water quality, only 60% of bodies of water are in good condition in this country. This is below the long-term target of 98%, which hasn't improved, unfortunately, in the last 4 years. So there are many win-wins to be secured if we get this right. We must address our genuine environmental challenges. And in doing so, we can stay ahead of our competitors and ensure our fantastic natural products succeed in tomorrow's markets. However, to deliver that win-win, we have to take many important decisions that lie ahead of us. Unfortunately, these decisions will be all the more difficult because of the budget negotiated by the UK Government. In the new cap, Scotland will probably have lower rates per hectare in both pillars than every other member state in Europe. That is even worse than what we actually get today. If Scotland had been a member state, we would have automatically got an uplift to €196 per hectare in Pillar 1, and I've said before, that would bring in an extra €1 billion up to 2020. And we could have negotiated an uplift in Pillar 2, like 16 other member states did. Finland got an extra €600 million uplift, Portugal €500 million, Slovenia €150 million, Lithuania €100 million, and so on. But the UK Government took the decision not to press Scotland's case. If they weren't willing to get us a decent deal from Europe, of course, the least they can deliver is a fair division of the funding within the UK. And we urgently need agreement on that. Well, yeah.
Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, and I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. We've heard a lot about the UK Government not batting for Scotland. As I recall, he was demanding an increase in the budget. At the same time, his MP colleagues were voting with Labour for a reduction in the budget, at the same time as his MEPs were voting to freeze it. Which of those positions represents the SNP's position on the budget?
Well, I'm sure the member will be aware that only 38% of the Europe budget is for CAP, and that's one particular area where Scotland gets a very, very raw deal in particular, and that's why we do deserve a greater share of the CAP budget within Europe. But the deadline for many of the decisions are now approaching, and by the end of this year we have to notify any pillar-to-pillar budget transfers that we want to have in this country. and I have written to Owen Paterson seeking a fair deal for Scotland within the UK's cap allocation, so we can now start taking these decisions. In particular, the UK received an uplift under the external convergence mechanism. This will be worth over €60 million per year by 2020, and a total of €230 million over the whole of the budget period. And that uplift only exists because of Scotland's low payments under the current system. Therefore, at the very least, Owen Paterson must allocate it entirely to Scotland. This is not a case of taking money away from farmers in England, Wales or Northern Ireland. It's making sure that money that belongs to Scottish farmers comes to Scottish farmers to help them through the challenges ahead. And the first challenge will be getting through 2014. In theory, the new cap was supposed to start on the 1st of January 2014. That was never realistic, of course, under Europe's timetable. And the main regulations won't even be adopted till November or December, as I said earlier on, and then we have to have all the implementation rules. So 2014 is going to be a transition year, and of course I was frustrated by the amount of time that Europe took to recognise that, but they now have come forward with a transition regulation, and we're now negotiating that. Despite all that uncertainty, I was able recently to set out a plan for 2014, and Europe has made it impossible to avoid a gap between the current SRDP and the new one, but our plan will minimise the impact on the ground, giving continuity where it's most needed, for instance with LFAS payments, agri-environment contracts and woodland creation. So we've now got more decisions to turn our minds to as well, and to inform these decisions we will run consultation exercises in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 starting towards the end of this year. I don't want to preempt the results of these consultations, but we have to give as much certainty as we can to the industry. So I want to give some thinking. So for instance, on the Pillar 1 basic payment scheme, there's emerging consensus around establishing either 2 or 3 payment regions in Scotland. That would be simpler than some other options, so I'm pretty well minded to go with that. On coupled support, if we're stuck with 8% of the Scottish ceiling, then I will give very serious consideration to devoting all of that to the beef sector. I know some sheep farmers will be disappointed to hear that, but their sector already stands to gain considerably from the move to area-based payments. I'm also keen to explore other options for weighting any future beef scheme. The current scheme gives higher rates to the first 10 calves per holding, but the data suggests a decline in the slightly bigger herds, so we must review that aspect as well. On greening, we will continue to look at the option of equivalence schemes, which we're allowed to put in place, but even the strongest supporters of equivalence are getting slightly cold feet as the details become clearer, and our analysis doesn't show huge benefits from equivalence schemes for biodiversity, for instance. So I want to reserve my judgment on that, but it looks quite complex. I do want to find out, however, if we can use equivalence schemes under greening to deliver carbon-reducing measures to help our climate change efforts in this country and the role that agriculture plays. Also in capping and degressivity, which is the reduction of payments of the big payments, there are arguments for and against that. I'm keen to address huge individual payments, but we have to consider what will happen to those payments in any case. The move to an area-based system should already reduce big payments significantly, so we should take that into account when deciding whether or not to apply an absolute cap to payments. There's also another measure called the redistributive payment, which is the idea of giving a top-up on the first, say, 30 or 50 hectares per farm. So again, we should look at these options. We've also got decisions to take in Pillar 2. As I draw to conclusion, Presiding Officer, I've said many times before, the new SRDP must be simpler for applicants. It must be better focused, particularly in key areas like climate change, food and drink, and support for hill farmers and crofters. But of course, the SRDP is not only for farmers, it's got a much wider role in supporting rural communities, and we have to bear that in mind. Many people, therefore, have got a big stake in the decisions we will be taking in the coming months. So with such crucial decisions ahead, I look forward to members' comments on the new Common Agricultural Policy. I hope Parliament will join me in welcoming our negotiating achievements. I hope you'll welcome our call to the UK Government for a much fairer budget deal so we can work towards a successful new policy for Scotland, so our farmers can continue to bring food to our tables and care for Scotland's magnificent environment.
I now call on Claire Baker to speak to move amendment number 7892.3. Ms Baker, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is an opportune time to have a CAP debate, and we shouldn't miss the opportunity today to discuss the key issues. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's press release this morning and the way in which he's addressed the debate this afternoon, which did begin to lay out some of the key issues facing us in Scotland. As my daughter was getting ready this morning for her school harvest service with the poem about all the farmers working hard, it is important to recognise the huge contribution farmers make to our food production and security, land stewardship and our rural as well as national economy. There are significant debates ongoing about food, affordability, accessibility, how we reconcile impressive growth export figures with growing food poverty at home. And farming, which, regardless of who receives more or where Scotland is on a subsidy league table, does receive significant public resources in return for a number of public benefits, some of those which are competing. And I think it is important in this debate not to lose sight of that. And while our focus is on how we implement the changes and try to get the best deal for those who receive the support, we also need to make sure we get the best deal for consumers and the wider community and economy. The European Parliament at the start of this process identified food security as key, but that was alongside rising energy prices, climate change, environmental protection, land abandonment and the economic crisis as the set of challenges a reformed CAP must respond to. I have to say I'm not convinced that what we have before us meets that challenge, and if Scotland is to respond effectively to these issues, implementation has a lot to deliver. Labour's amendment today focuses on the complex matters of the choices we have to make in Scotland. This is now the phase when the decision-making lies with the Scottish Government, and after a pretty protracted period of negotiation, we are now facing a fairly tight timescale for introduction. The Scottish Government are soon consulting on these issues, but as the Scottish Environment Link briefing says, government clarity on objectives and desired outcomes is essential here if a bun fight between different farming sectors, beef versus arable versus dairy, is to be avoided. So at the committee last week, the Cabinet Secretary laid out 3 options for the transfer from historic to area payments. I have cautioned previously over using the Irish tunnel model, and while we now have agreement on a principle of a new entrance fund, and that fund is very much welcome and we should prioritise its introduction in Scotland, and perhaps in light of this there is more room to have a more gradual approach towards convergence. There is a risk that the Irish tunnel model would slow reform too much, and that while cushioning the change for some, it will mean that others who are in need of support would have to wait much longer. The Cabinet Secretary has this afternoon talked about securing the Scottish clause. It would be good to have some clarity on the Scottish clause. The end of slipper farming has been a key aim of the reform, but it looks like there is a risk of other loopholes being created. There could be unintended attractions created, encouraging some land to now become eligible for Pillar 1. The flexibility of setting a minimum stocking level seems key to this policy being effective. Can the Cabinet Secretary say a bit more about what the current understanding is? His press release this morning talked about minimum activity levels. Is he confident that this will be able to address the issue? The Cabinet Secretary is fond of per hectare average comparisons. They are accurate, and I support a fairer distribution of funds throughout the EU and the UK and accept that this is the measure that is used, but they also fit the Cabinet Secretary's preferred narrative. But we know it is much more complex than that. We can recognise how the situation came about. The payments are historic. Scotland's 1.5 hectares present some unique farming challenges. And we have been working with a system which has heavily rewarded productivity, but has not sufficiently recognised what Scotland's less favoured farming areas deliver. The Link briefing today highlights the importance of high nature value farming, and I think a few of us were at the RSPB briefing earlier in Parliament. The average per hectare calculations do give a distorted picture. They mask significantly different payments. So when the Cabinet Secretary makes claims about farmers being £6,000 a year better off, that's really not the whole picture. It's not as simple as an average per hectare payments. What does that figure tell us about recipients in East Lothian who receive an average payment of over €125,000 per hectare, while Highland region receives an average of just over 34 hectares? It doesn't actually tell us very much. And if we look at other measures, such as per holding or per worker, which is surely an important measure if we're looking at public benefit, Scotland and the UK are much higher in EU league tables, and Scotland even receives more than the rest of the UK on some of these figures.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks to Claire Baker for giving way. Firstly, the figures she reads out illustrate why we have to move from the historic basis of payments to a new basis of payments, and that's why we're moving to area basis of payments, because we can't reward people in activity they had back in 2002, in 2013, or indeed 2020. So that's the explanation behind the figures the member mentions. But the point about the formula that would benefit Scotland is it's the formula that Europe used to allocate the national pots of money to each member state. And that is the formula that's there, and that's what would have delivered the greater national pot to Scotland as a member state, which then we could have chosen how to distribute amongst the Highland Farms and the East Lothian Farms and so on.
Ms Baker, you will have time.
Thank you. I do accept that that's a formula that is used, but the point I'm making is that the story behind that is much more complex, and it's not just about providing a fairer formula throughout the EU and the UK. It is about the decisions Scotland will make to ensure we have a fairer distribution within Scotland. And the EU does work with a per hectare measure, and you could argue it's as valid as any measure, but I think it's not the only measure that we can look and make comparisons with. The UK uplift is largely down to the nature of historic payments in Scotland, and of course we are behind England on this, as they have already made changes to area payments, which again has had an impact on the figures. The question now is, how do we get a fairer, more equitable distribution of funds throughout the UK? How do we achieve a commitment to convergence from the UK Government with a clear timetable? How do we get a level playing field operating throughout the UK? This is of more benefit to Scottish farmers than a protracted negotiation into the EU. We often hear the assertion we would see significant additional cap funds from independence, and in a debate before becoming a minister, Paul Wheelhouse even claimed when Scotland becomes independent, the full economic benefit of convergence between member states will be delivered to Scotland automatically. And yet increasingly we see the terms of Scotland's EU membership being questioned. From claiming it would be automatic, the SNP are now acknowledging negotiations. I
thank Claire Baker for taking intervention, since she mentions my previous statement. I think what I'm trying to say is that, and I hope that she would acknowledge, take the opportunity to acknowledge, that if we were an independent member state in our own right, we would have benefited from the new formula in terms of convergence on the national pot, and that's the point the Cabinet Secretary is making. I'd certainly welcome her clarity on whether she agrees with that principle.
Ms Baker, I will add time for you.
But that is not the situation we're facing. What the SNP are proposing is that we go into the EU as a new member state, and the concerns around negotiations there, what would that mean for Scottish farming? For example, could you guarantee that payments to farmers would continue during any negotiations? And furthermore, if we look at recent examples, new member states, including those who joined in 2007, they have had direct EU payments, all have been phased in gradually, and that would be disastrous for Scottish farming. But perhaps we can move on to an area that we agree on, and I do agree with the Cabinet Secretary that Owen Paterson needs to listen and respond positively to the debate. We need an equitable solution for the UK. I accept this as a challenging negotiation for the Cabinet Secretary, but the Cabinet Secretary will also have to deliver on the degree of redistribution he argues for across the EU and within the UK, and start to be clear about what level of support will be available to farming in Scotland's more disadvantaged areas. There has been suggestions that the maximum degree of modulation from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 will take place, and as the Liberal amendment highlights, this is a decision that will have to be made quite soon, and we support arguments for greater funding into Pillar 2 in order to deliver an effective SRDP programme. I know there are concerns being raised by some in the farming sector over the impact this degree of modulation will have on Pillar 1. But we need to consider our commitment to meet our environmental challenges. And if we were to see boosts to the agri-environment schemes which have previously had a cut, if we could boost those schemes, we could deliver benefits for both. Last week we had the IPCC report clearly setting out the global challenges, and we know that the farming sector in Scotland does have a pretty significant environmental impact. Emissions from agriculture and related land use account for some 20% of total Scottish emissions. The example this week of John Mackenzie from Dingwall, who's running a carbon-neutral flying business with all the energy generated from his farm, demonstrates the kind of commitment and innovation that is out there to improve performance. Currently, we have no statutory measures placed on the sector, but there is some way to go, and using incentives and good practice are essential, but we do need to see more action in this area. And if we could boost some of the funds into Pillar 2, that could go some way to helping us meet that. The other significant area is how we implement degressivity. I believe we need much more transparency around payments. We need a better explanation of how public benefit is gained from some of the large farm payments that are being made to profitable farms. The payments must be justifiable. Speaking to a senior figure in food and drink recently, they said that the most innovative produce, the most diverse business models, the most modern farming is often coming from younger farmers who've been receiving no level of public subsidy, but they are growing businesses and they do have potential to do more. And while the new entrant scheme will ease some of this, though I know the Cabinet Secretary agrees that part of that solution must be looking at land availability and tenancies if we're to improve the lot of new entrants, we must also be prepared to focus resources where they give the greatest public benefit. I was interested in Alan Smith, MEP's comments in this area this week when he said the agreement didn't go far enough in terms of capping and that we have simply not addressed popular concerns on this issue. And when everyone is having to tighten their belts, it's only right that the nation's wealthiest farmers should do as well. So it's now up to the Cabinet Secretary to address this issue and indicate where he thinks that balance should lie and what is proportionate and fair. So we need to be clear about our priorities for implementation, and we would be better spending our time today having that significant debate and sending a clear message to the UK Government about delivering a fairer funding deal throughout the UK than making referendum arguments that have little relevance to the CAP deal, which is determined now until 2020. I move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Alec Fergusson to speak to move amendment number 7892.2. Mr Fergusson, you've got 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is one of the debates on which I wish it were possible for Parliament to speak with one voice. It often has managed to do so on this topic in the past, but I regret that it seems to be highly unlikely that that will be the case at decision time this evening. And I think that's not just a great shame, I think it's also a missed opportunity by the Government, because I think there is much in this debate around which I really genuinely believe we could have agreed. And surely the Government even would agree that a unanimous vote from this Parliament carries a much stronger message to both the UK Government and to the EU than the fragmented result that I fear we will see later this afternoon. Had today's motion reflected the perfectly reasonable tone taken by the Cabinet Secretary in his speech this afternoon, we might have achieved such unanimity, but I don't think that is going to be the case, and certainly the motion did not reflect that reasonable tone in my view. When I started to read the motion, I was actually filled with optimism that we really were going to debate the really important issues that face rural Scotland in the wake of this CAP reform package, and there are many of them, and I hope we can concentrate on those. But as I read on, Presiding Officer, my heart slowly sank as we came to what I can only call a remarkable self-congratulatory part of the motion, when we're asked to welcome the Scottish Government's success in negotiating certain provisions that meet Scotland's needs in various fields. And yet that phrase, success in negotiating, is penned by the same Cabinet Secretary who is forever complaining that he can't negotiate anything because he hasn't got a seat at the top table. Well, I just don't see how you can have it both ways. What I do very much welcome is the fact that the UK Government was clearly impressed enough with the Scottish Government's arguments on these issues that it negotiated hard for them, often, I believe, against its own instincts, succeeded in those negotiations and returned with a deal on CAP reform that might not have given us everything we wanted, but which the Cabinet Secretary pronounced was a good deal for Scotland. So I do find myself asking why the motion then calls for us to deplore that agreement. Now, let's just get real for a minute. We all know that the overall EU budget has been reduced. How could it have been otherwise in these economic times? And let's not forget, as Liam MacArthur reminded us, that the SNP's representatives at Westminster voted for that budget reduction. So it surely could have come as no surprise that there is less money in the CAP budget. And the question should not be about how much blame and vitriol we can pour on the UK Government. It should be about how we can maximise the benefit of a smaller pot of money through the two pillars of CAP report. As I think Claire Baker hinted, that may not suit the Government's agenda on the outcome of next year's referendum, but it is the question that most people who live and work in rural Scotland want an answer to. So let me focus on those issues. And I have to say I have a lot of sympathy with the Cabinet Secretary on the task that he now has in front of him, because the changes that he now has to implement are going to involve many winners and losers across the agricultural sector, as we would all recognise, as Pillar 1 support moves from historic to area-based payments. It is worth reflecting, I think, exactly why Scotland has a historically low level of CAP funding. It is simply because our historic payments have always been based on stock numbers and productivity. And as we all know, and are constantly reminded of, 85% of Scotland's land is classed as less favoured. We are geographically less productive and therefore historically have received less support. The change to area-based payments, which as the Cabinet Secretary understandably hinted at in his opening remarks, will inevitably have the broad effect of moving support payments up the hill. And this therefore presents the government with a huge challenge: how to bring about the change without actually destroying the viability, possibly even the very existence, of some agricultural businesses. And in looking for the best answer to that question, I cannot disagree with the NFU of Scotland's priority of focusing Pillar 1 payments on active, productive farming businesses in a carefully targeted way that will minimise the flattening effect of these reforms. And I have to say that I think that points us towards having 3 distinct payment regions rather than 2. I'm pleased the Scottish Government can use up to 8% of the Scottish CAP budget for coupled payment, which I strongly support. But I will also take the argument for increasing that amount by having access to the whole of the UK CAP budget ceiling for modulation to the UK Government, because I also believe that we will probably need to go above that level of 8% maximum if the necessary safeguards are to be put in place to sustain our hill farming sector without causing irreparable damage to the other sectors of agriculture. And it's also clear, as I think the Cabinet Secretary also referred to, that there are going to be huge pressures on the Pillar 2 budget as well, because yet again we have a smaller pot of jam having to be spread over a much larger slice of bread from 2015. Now, these reforms give the Cabinet Secretary the power to increase the amount that can be modulated from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 from the current 4% to 15%, as Claire Baker has already mentioned, without match funding. And I'm sure he will be sorely tempted and heavily lobbied, certainly, to use that power. Now, unlike Claire Baker, and I suspect this is where I may be going to lose some potential support for our amendment this afternoon, I would urge him to resist that temptation, because every percentage decrease in Pillar 1 support will simply undermine what is going to be a very fragile agricultural sector that is going to be struggling to come to terms with a very different support structure over the next few years. It deserves time to do so. And above all else, it surely needs to know what that structure is likely to be as soon as is humanly possible to allow for effective forward planning. Now, I will argue for Scotland to have a greater share of the CAP resources within the UK. And I accept the case for the external convergence uplift largely to come to Scotland. The Cabinet Secretary told the RACI Committee 2 weeks ago that this could amount to, I think it was €60 million by 2019. I think he repeated that this afternoon. That's a considerable amount of money that would not be coming to the member state of the UK unless Scotland was in the position that we find ourselves in. So there is a perfectly logical case to be made. But I will make that argument using the language of persuasion and the arguments of logic, because I don't think the Cabinet Secretary does his arguments any favour when he publicly accuses the UK Government, as he did in the committee 2 weeks ago, of stealing Scotland's money. The rhetoric might fit the referendum agenda, presiding officer, but it is not doing Scottish agriculture any favours. The simple reality is that the CAP reform package is now firmly in the hands of the Cabinet Secretary. As the headline of last week's Scottish Farmer put it so succinctly, over to you, ScotGov. Indeed it is, and I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. And I now call on Tavish Scott to speak to and move Amendment 7892.1. 7 minutes, please, Mr Scott.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Firstly, could I draw members' attention to my declaration of members' interests. I spent last Saturday, as many of us would at this time of year, in the local mart in Lerwick, and there were 2 clear messages. Well, there was a third, but that's not important for this debate. But the first was on prices. As the Minister will be all too well aware, there's some concern, particularly in the sheep sector, about what is happening in relation to livestock prices. But the second, and more important in the context of today's debate, was for the government of the day and for politicians not to see the agriculture debate about the future of the Common Agricultural Policy through the prism of independence, but rather to see it through the needs of Scotland's farmers and crofters. And can I make that point in the reasonable tone that the Minister adopted in his opening remarks to him, because it is surely in all of our interests that that be the approach that we follow at this time. For this reason, that since 2001, Scotland's sheep numbers have fallen by the thick end of 1 million, and in 2012, 495 producers across Scotland came out of beef production. That's nearly 500 less beef herds in Scotland out of what, some 7,000. Now that, for any of us, is surely a worrying and very significant trend. So the government's admirable food and drink strategy, which I support and believe is genuinely a positive aspect of government activity, is in that sense being undermined because the building bricks of food production are being eroded. And that is surely what the new CAP should be all about. Do we want active, financially viable farmers and crofters and growers across Scotland? I think most of us would answer that in the positive. So I suggest, as colleagues have already, that there are some areas of action that the Scottish Government need to take forward. And I recognise that the Minister set some of these out in his opening address. The first is that the consultation that we understand is to be published in December should recognise the timescale that the Minister is operating to. If, for example, he adopts, as is the usual government practice, a 3-month period, that will not finish until March. As he said in his own remarks, the timescale by which the implementation regulations have to then be approved by the European Commission, in my view, put an immense amount of pressure on the government to have all that in place for the 1st of January 2015. So certainly as far as I can see, and certainly as far as a lot of farmers have said to me as well, if the government rightly consult on many of these issues, there is no need necessarily to spend as long as we do on everything else, given, as the Minister did in his opening remarks, set out some very clear direction of travel on some of these issues. What I do think he does need to consult on, though, is ensuring that all the options are available to the government in making the right judgments over how the new area payment system will work. Certainly, of course, coupled beef support to assist suckler cow herds is one. But I don't share Claire Baker's concerns over the so-called Irish tunnel. I believe the Cabinet Secretary should consult on that mechanism because of the really strong views around transition from the current system to the new one that will take place over these coming 6 years. A fast drop into a new world is going to mean for some, without a shadow of a doubt, 25 to 50% cuts in single farm payment. So therefore, a system which has clearly got some favour in Europe in respect of understanding the length of time needed for transition for farmers and crofters to adapt to the new system must have some merit in it. Now, I hope and maybe ask that the Cabinet Secretary in his wind-up this evening would recognise that that is potentially an option that Scottish agriculture may wish to follow, and he would therefore seek to include it in his consultation when it's published later in the year. The other aspect to that is the recognition that he made, and I agree with him, that the average payments, moving towards an average payment system based on area, will hit some producers, notably intensive livestock farmers, potentially very hard indeed. And that, I think, supports the contention over the Irish tunnel model. The other area that the CAP consultation he is about to publish, I think, surely must consider is areas of natural constraint. Now, he mentioned that in his opening remarks, and I hope he might just clarify that for us again in his wind-up, because my understanding is that the ANC system, the model, can be used to help areas such as agriculturally productive islands facing real pressure, again, because of these changes. Orkney, Islay, Tiree would all be obvious examples of those kind of pressures. And it would be helpful for the agricultural industry if the Cabinet Secretary could clarify how he envisages, or whether he envisages, rather, ANCs being part of that and using it in that, and making sure it's therefore in his consultation. The third aspect is just on the level of area payment per hectare. I've highlighted the decline in livestock numbers across Scotland. Many farmers and crofters, including in my own Shetland constituency, want a higher rate of per hectare than not, and that, of course, has very significant issues, as he's rightly pointed out, for others, and it's understandable in that case that would be so. And therefore, how, as he made clear in his opening remarks, his 2 or 3 payment areas model fits into that assessment of how individual farmers and crofters will be affected is, I think, important. And could I encourage him, as we did in a debate some months ago, to publish modelling in this area? I do not know quite where the Scottish Government's modelling has got to, but I think it would be helpful to the industry to understand what modelling has happened and whether it, at this stage, could identify the differences that must already be becoming apparent were a 2 or 3 payment system to be followed. The other 2 points I simply wanted to make in my remarks, Presiding Officer, were to very much agree with Alec Ferguson's point on the balance between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 spending, and hope the Minister Cabinet Secretary might clarify that in his closing remarks. I share the concern that were the heap of money, as it were, to be moved across to Pillar 2, then the budgetary pressures in Pillar 1 in relation to what that means for individual farmers and crofters would be even more significant than they are already likely to be. And I know that won't make him any friends in the green NGOs, but these are the horrible balances that any minister has to take. And the final point, Presiding Officer, is on the mapping penalty regime for individual farms across that I've mentioned many times to the Minister. He has reassured me in the past that the new cap will be a fairer system to that. Can I simply hope that that is the case? Can I encourage him to keep making that argument and ensure that Brussels and therefore the Scottish Government as the responsible administration for the new cap absolutely insist on having a fairer and more proportionate system that can help, or at least not be so unfair on crofters and farmers, not just in my Shetland constituency, but right across the country.
Many thanks. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 6 minutes, please. I call Rob Gibson, to be followed by David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's been some suggestions that we would be better not to have a fragmented approach. But I think when you look at the motion before us and the amendments, the fragmentation comes at the point where we are told that we should not look at the potential for Scotland were we negotiating for ourselves. That's where the fragmentation line splits 3 parties against the government. And, you know, the budget deal negotiated by the UK government failed to address Scotland's unacceptably low cap funding. And it's clear that Scotland's priorities are not Westminster's priorities, but Westminster's ministers do represent us in Europe. So, well, I'm hardly started, but...
Alex Fergusson.
Better early, Mr Gibson, I think. If that is the case, why did the Cabinet Secretary describe the deal that came back from Brussels as a good deal for Scotland?
Rob Gibson.
The Cabinet Secretary was talking about the bits which we had got into the deal, the bits related to dealing with active farming, the Scottish clause, these sort of things. That is a win in a limited field. But the UK government did not fight for a better allocation of funding of both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 funds. Scotland has demanded an uplift in our rural development budgets. After all, with the lowest budgets, not just in the UK, but in the whole of Europe. So unlike 16 other countries, the UK failed to negotiate a special uplift or our fairer share for Scotland. That surely is a matter of deep concern across this Parliament. To retain active agriculture and keep our land productive, to maintain food production, to safeguard our environment, to remain competitive and maintain populations living in our rural communities, the settled view of Scotland is that we need ongoing support from Europe. The UK position is to end direct support for Scottish agriculture, particularly Pillar 1. So there's a clash between the whole Scottish community and the way in which some of the parties in here wish to portray this motion. To reverse the decline in livestock numbers and keep cattle and sheep in our hills and protect our red meat supply chain and produce for the domestic and export market, Scotland wants the option of coupled support. The UK position is that there should be no coupled support. So that is another fault line in the story. Now, Scotland is demanding that our cast-iron case for a fair share of EU farm budget is recognised. It has not been recognised in London. And that since we received the 4th lowest level of payments in Europe, the UK position is that the case has not been proven. And indeed, they're trying to invent other formulae to try and siphon money away from what should be Scotland's. And when the Cabinet Secretary talked about stealing money, he was alluding to that danger which occurred from Owen Paterson's own mouth. Owen Paterson, the Secretary of State for Agriculture, came to our committee on the 12th of June this year. And he said, "I came in September with a clear remit from the Prime Minister to grow the rural economy and to improve the environment." Well, if he is intent on that in terms of Scotland's rural economy, then he's got to prove that he actually is going to put in place the mechanisms that allow us to do so. He said, working with ministers in the devolved administrations, we have a huge role in helping to grow the farming and food production sector. How do you do that if there's no coupled payments? How do you do that if there's not a proper supply of red meat? I think that we have pretty much got an awful lot of what we wanted, he went on to say. Well, I totally disagree. We didn't get what we wanted because we've still got the lowest payments in Europe. The days of significant public support leading to the production of unwanted food products are gone, he said. And my whole drive throughout the reform is to keep the CAP moving in the right direction. That is downwards. That is not supporting the development of our rural economy. And when you think about people lining up to get food from food banks at the moment, and the Secretary of State in London is talking about unwanted food production, surely there's a disconnect there that is appalling in terms of its intent, and that this country would like to be able to feed all of its people. Now, Owen Paterson opposes Pillar 1 support, as I've said, saying that we should rely on the market. He fails to see the link for coupled payments for cattle being key to protecting our biodiversity. By keeping cattle in the hills and on the Macher, that is how we maintain our biodiversity. So you have to have Pillar 1 strong, along with Pillar 2 aims for public goods. He described global warming recently as positive. Well, this is an incredible statement because our biodiversity is hugely threatened by any global warming. Indeed, in the Monday's Guardian, he praised the alleged positives that would come from global warming. The Secretary of State is in charge of tackling climate change at a UK level. You should be well aware of the deeply damaging impact climate change will have at home and abroad, not least when it comes to our farming. So we have unfortunately been informed by Owen Paterson's office that he's not going to be able to attend our committee due to his Wednesdays and Thursdays being taken up this side of Christmas. His diary is full. Our demands are unmet, and basically I would ask the Parliament to support this resolution, this motion, because it gets to the heart of the matter and it evolves a policy which can take Scotland's food and drink forward.
Thank you very much. I now call David Stewart, who will be followed by Angus MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think it was President Dwight Eisenhower who famously said that farming looks mightily easy when your plough is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from the cornfield. It's of course tempting to draw a comparison with the architects of the CAP. Just when we all get to grips with the 4 axes model, the European Commission comes along and abolishes them. However, complexity and timescale does not negate importance. Whilst of course I welcome the final agreement of the new CAP, I share the frustration of many, not least some of the members speaking before me, that it's taken so long to agree and we're months away from final completion. However, in fairness, I would welcome the Cabinet Secretary's allocation of 70 million from the portfolio's draft budget to effectively fund the transition between the 2 programmes, mitigating to a point the uncertainty of EU delays. And as we all know, the new CAP is crucial for farmers and, of course, rural communities. The needs of the agriculture sector are critical in many ways to Scotland's future. It's essential that the SRDP is tailored to the reality of modern life in rural Scotland, with its rich diversity of individuals, enterprises and communities. The report by the Scottish Agricultural College, Rural Scotland in Focus, reflected that diversity and called for government policies to be tailored to the wider reality of rural Scotland. In a similar vein, Presiding Officer, the Carnegie UK Trust article, which was Future Directions in Rural Development, called for greater investment in capacity building and networking at community level. And this echoes views expressed previously by organisations such as the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. But of course, the new SRDP, as we've heard, has the potential to benefit not just the farming industry and Scotland's environment, but Scotland's rural communities. And of course, the toolkit is the community-led local development strategies such as LEADER and an extended and improved Scottish National Rural Network. Now, it's essential, Presiding Officer, when we address the complex technicalities of CAP that many members, not least the Cabinet Secretary, have referred to, we don't lose sight of the vital dimension that it's intended to be a policy that benefits all of those that live in rural Scotland. I will focus my remarks, Presiding Officer, on the Pillar 2 Rural Development Programme, but it's perhaps worth pausing for a second to look back into history. As we all know, agriculture support, but more specifically support for farmers in the development of agricultural produce for the export market, was arguably an early driver for the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And again, as members know, the powerful dynamic between France and Germany, which is reflected in foreign affairs and defence, demonstrates the strength of that relationship between these countries. But that presents major challenges for us in the review, the reform and renewal of CAP. But one of the bigger questions this afternoon, and Rob Gibson touched on this, is the whole issue of why do we need public support for agriculture? And of course, we know the international picture. It's one of a crisis in global food prices, inflation that's led to food riots in nearly every continent apart from Europe. In addition, instability in the Middle East has hit the price of oil and affected transport and fertiliser costs. So the key point is that the security of supply is not just about energy markets, but a key element in CAP as well. Now, Presiding Officer, we probably need the foresight of the brand seer in order to predict exactly what the Scottish allocation of CAP is going to be. But we do know, as has been pointed out, there's been an overall cut of 11 and 12% in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 in the EU budget and the overall CAP. However, Scotland can gain, as we heard earlier, due to the external convergence mechanism, an EU-wide device to boost direct payments for the lowest recipients. However, the New Deal does allow much more flexibility for Member States to move funds from one pillar to another through modulation. And Alex Fergusson touched on that earlier. This will support much-needed rural development. And perhaps the Cabinet Secretary in his wind-up, if he's paying attention, can perhaps indicate whether he's planning to use the full 15% voluntary modulation from Pillar 1 to 2. And of course, Pillar 2 rural development programmes must be linked to the 6 key priorities, which include enhancing competitiveness, promoting ecosystems and developing social inclusion and poverty reductions. But the new arrangements will allow a lot more flexibility in how money is spent by individual member states. So we know that Pillar 2 has a crucial role to play in supporting and developing the delivery of public goods and services by agriculture, but as a number of member states, not least the Cabinet Secretary, the UK receives the lowest share of all EU member states, and Scotland's the lowest share of the 4 countries in the UK. So the new arrangements allow for sub-programmes in future SRDB, and that could help us fund vital programmes that will help existing and new crofter schemes, particularly for new entrants. After a recent meeting I've had with the Crofting Commission, Presiding Officer, it's clear to me that there's a growing concerns within crofting communities about how much real money will be allocated to the new crofters programme. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could give some assurances as his wind-up. So I want to see a future rural development programme that has strong environmental stewardships, that works actively to secure biodiversity and manage landscapes and habitats, and that stresses the needs of people in rural and remote areas. Rural development needs people's intelligence and individuality, and the acid test will be how the CAP delivers for most fragile and remote rural areas.
Many thanks. I now call Angus MacDonald to be followed by Graham Day. We have a small amount of time in hand for interventions.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. As we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary, the long drawn-out saga of CAP reform is finally reaching a close, with a vote in the full European Parliament in mid-November and then final adoption by the Council at the end of November or December. And I'm sure every farmer and crofter in the land will breathe a sigh of relief when that happens. The Scottish farmer last week welcomed the CAP agreement on the finer details with the headline, "Over to you, ScotGov," as Alex Fergusson has already referred to. Well, that's fair enough. It is up to the Scottish Government now to get the best fit for Scotland's agricultural and rural needs. What isn't fair is the fact that the Scottish Government is having to do so with one hand tied behind its back. Despite the Scottish Government's success in negotiating provisions that meet Scotland's needs on new entrants, active farming and increased flexibilities, without a seat at the top table, Scotland's lost out. We fare badly in both pillars of CAP spending. In Pillar 1, we receive €597 million a year, which equates to €130 per hectare, compared to the UK average of €229 and the EU average of €268. In comparison with all EU member states, we have the 4th lowest Pillar 1 payment per hectare, above only Estonia, Latvia and Romania. If Scotland was a member state in its own right, we would have qualified for increased Pillar 1 payments worth €1 billion extra up to 2020 and been able to negotiate improved Pillar 2 rural funding. In Pillar 2, Scotland fares even worse. Scotland receives about €360 million over 7 years, which is only €9 per hectare, the lowest in the whole of the EU, compared to €15 per hectare for the UK and €115 per hectare for the EU. Now, we don't yet know what Scotland's share of rural development UK budget for 2014-2020 will be. However, the UK allocation of €350 million in 2014 will fall to 306 by 2020, a total in 2014 of only €20 per hectare, the worst in Europe. Now, if that's really the best that Better Together can do, frankly, you can keep it. Sorry, I've got a lot to get in my 6 minutes. Ireland gets €70 per hectare, Finland 138 and the Czech Republic 83. Now, with friends like the UK government negotiating at the top table for us, you'd be forgiven for wondering who needs enemies. Of course, it gets worse. As we heard from the UK Environment Secretary, Owen Patterson, when he appeared before our RAC committee before summer recess, there's little chance of us getting the full £60 million uplift in CAP funds that the UK government will receive as a result of CAP convergence due to Scotland from the uplift in CAP funds, which it will only receive because Scotland remains, for now, part of the UK. Unless, of course, the Cabinet Secretary can give us some good news on that front in his closing speech. However, having seen Owen Patterson's pronouncements in recent days, ranging from welcoming what he called the benefits of global warming and wanting to end direct support completely, I'm afraid I don't hold out much hope. Not only is the UK government poorly representing us in Brussels, they're withholding funding that is rightly Scotland's. However, they have a track record on that, given their point-blank refusal to return the annual £1.4 million red meat levy, which Scottish livestock producers pay when their stock are killed south of the border. It's clear that Scotland's priorities are not Westminster's priorities, but Westminster ministers negotiate on our behalf in Europe and have singularly failed to fight for a better allocation of funding of both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Now, I don't particularly want my speech to turn into a moan fest, so on a more positive note, I was pleased to hear my colleague and committee convener Rob Gibson mention crofting. We have to make sure the crofters' voice is heard when the finer details of support in Scotland are being decided, and it's important that crofters are fully consulted on the detailed plans of Pillars 1 and 2 when the consultations with stakeholders take place later in the year. Now, in checking my speech on last year's CAP debate, I noticed I'd warned that Scotland's beef farmers were facing a challenge which could lead to a beef exodus, with the latest figures from QMS showing that every suckler cow was losing £130 per year before support payments were accounted for. If this continues, we'll reach a stage where there are no cows grazing on the hills and uplands, with no calves coming forward to supply lowland beef finishers and ultimately cutting the supply of Scotch beef to consumers. It's clear that the best way to ensure a viable future for suckler beef production is to channel support into production of beef calves, which will in turn maintain the upland environment through proper stocking rates and maintaining rural communities. And it's not just suckler herds. If you travel around the Outer Hebrides today, you'll see common grazings on the hill bereft of sheep. For 20 years ago, you would see flocks of sheep grazing. Now you see not one. And we heard Tavish Scott allude to that situation earlier. Now, I know that the Scottish Crofting Federation's conference held in Stornoway recently looked at how CAP, including SRDP, and development initiatives such as community renewable energy projects could help to revive the use of common grazings and realise their huge potential for crofting communities. Common grazings make up nearly 600,000 hectares of land under crofting tenure. However, common grazings have been underused and even abandoned in some areas. That clearly has to be reversed. Grazing such land in a controlled way protects it, increases biodiversity and keeps it accessible. So there's an opportunity to reverse the so-called retreat from the hills with imaginative initiatives, and I look forward to the crofting communities and other organisations putting forward their ideas in the coming months. I did have some other comments to make, Presiding Officer. However, I see that time is running out. So in closing, while the Scottish Government is doing what it can, it's clear Westminster Government couldn't care less about Scotland's farmers. Only with independence will Scotland have the powers it needs to secure a fair deal for our Scottish farmers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, there is a bit of extra time for members who wish to take interventions. Graham Day to be followed by Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin my contribution by focusing on Pillar 2 and how, from a greatly reduced funding pot, it will be made to work to deliver for rural Scotland. And, Presiding Officer, by rural Scotland, I don't just mean the farming sector, because there is much more to rural Scotland than farming, or indeed forestry, hugely important though both are. We're told that only around 17% of people living in rural Scotland actually make their living from farming and 16% from forestry. That means up to 2/3 of the rural population, at least those in employment, may be engaged in activities which aren't necessarily traditionally rural. Now, of course, within that figure will be people who commute to towns and cities to earn their living. But given the huge investment being made...
David Stewart.
Member giving way, and I support very strongly the point he's making about rural development. Would you share my view that looking for a maximum modulation of 15% from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 is something we should be aiming for?
Graham Day.
I think there's a balance to be struck in that regard. Given the huge investment being made in delivering an acceptable standard of broadband to rural parts of our country, then we must ensure that SRDP funding continues to encourage people to set up all sorts of businesses and helping sustain existing businesses in a rural setting, thereby supporting local economies and, of course, reducing CO2 emissions through lowering car miles. Of course, Pillar 2 is there to support things like LFAS and new entrants, and much of it will go to the farming sector. But contrary to what some in agriculture seem to think, it is not exclusively for supporting farming. Pillar 1 is there exclusively to provide support for farming. Pillar 2 is there for a wide range of activities. Yet, perusing the latest edition of NFUS's Scottish Farming Leader, I was struck by an article in the CAP which insisted that if the Scottish Government was to transfer funds from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, this should be matched and the combined sums channelled towards accessible and practical measures that underpin farming and crofting. Now, whilst I appreciate entirely that the NFUS is going to fight the corner of its members, I cannot help but feel that these demands betray a belief that Pillar 2 is, if not quite lock, stock and barrel, then not far off, there for farmers to access, when actually it's also there to support programmes such as LEADER and other lifeline funding for rural areas. And the situation regarding transition arrangements for LEADER is a concerning one, given that LEADER gave out, I think, £12 million in the last financial year. The nature of what SRDP is for was reinforced within this building on Tuesday evening when the Rural Policy Cross-Party Group received a briefing from Mike McKenzie of the Commission's DG Agri, who works within the unit dealing with the fundamental principles and structures of the EU's rural development policy. Mr McKenzie made clear that the rural development policy running from 2014 to 2020 must, and I quote, achieve a balanced territorial development of rural economies and communities, including the creation and maintenance of employment, and that included amongst the 6 union priorities was, and again I quote, economic development in rural areas, end quote. Now, I speak as an MSP for just such a rural area, one where farming is hugely important, but one which has also seen vital support given to non-agricultural businesses. The prospering quarrying company, whose £1.2 million new processing plant and offices I had the pleasure of opening. A company that provides the only source of quarried Angus sandstone, employing around 20 full-timers and looking to develop a training programme. And the small architectural business, which, with the help of grant aid from SRDP, is building a brand new HQ in a rural setting and aiming to double its workforce, keeping young, newly qualified architects in the rural communities they come from. Now, I'm aware that the Scottish Government has spent the last 18 months consulting with stakeholders on the next SRDP and with a more detailed second consultation to follow. And I welcome his confirming in opening the debate that the SRDP has a wider role than simply supporting farming. But if he can, in his closing remarks, it would, I think, be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could shed some light on how he will seek to ensure that we continue to encourage and support non-farming or forestry businesses to locate or remain in rural settings. Presiding Officer, there are so many important aspects of CAP that each of us participating in this debate could choose just one or two to cover in our contributions, and there would still be a number left untouched. But we simply cannot get away from the fundamental issue of funding. By any determination, the position Scotland finds itself in that regard, is unacceptable. The facts are there. The situation regarding funding, and in particular the prospect of Scotland not receiving the full external convergence uplift worth around €11 million in 2014, rising to €60 million in 2019. that the UK only receive because of Scotland is a gross wrong. And let me acknowledge that it isn't only SNP members of the Rural Affairs Committee who have recognised the inherent unfairness at work here. Alex Fergusson reiterated his worries today. But it seems Mr Patterson isn't listening. In front of the Rural Affairs Committee, his message essentially was one telling Scotland it would get what it was getting and should concentrate on how to spend that. And winding up, Presiding Officer, I want to look over the horizon to the next CAP for a moment, if I may. Because it is possible to look beyond 2020 and see what the future holds if we remain within the Union with England, that is. Presiding Officer, in considering the forthcoming CAP, one should not lose sight of what's coming down the track beyond that if Scotland remains in the UK and, of course, the UK remains in Europe. I recognise we're speculating here, but let's assume this happens and the Conservatives, maybe propped up by the Lib Dems, maybe not, are still in power at Westminster. Because this Parliament, just a few months ago, was given a telling insight into the future of what the future would hold for our agricultural sector when Owen Patterson appeared before the Rural Affairs Committee. The Rural Affairs Secretary, and let's give him credit for candour, was quite clear in his view on direct support for Scotland's farmers. If the UK remains part of Europe, he at very least wants to greatly reduce this, something that would have seriously bad news for Scotland. Claire Baker suggested earlier that any hiatus in direct payments would be problematic for Scotland's farmers. How damaging would removing them be when, as Alex Fergusson pointed out at the committee to Owen Patterson, Pillar 1 spending is incredibly important to Scotland. Now, to be accurate, Mr Patterson believes there is a role for continuing to compensate farmers for environmental benefit, and he has indicated that he would direct some of the money saved to research and marketing. Specifically, he's on record expressing the belief that a proportion of the money saved by slashing support to Scotland's farmers will be better deployed supporting England's wine industry, of which he's a fan. The truth is that slashing direct support would be hugely harmful to Scottish farming, although his honesty is welcome in the context of the independence debate. Presiding Officer, in agriculture, as in so many other walks of life, the situation is evidence-based and clear. Scotland's best interests are not served by remaining a part of the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Jane Baxter to be followed by Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It does not seem so long ago that we were gathered here in this chamber to discuss the CAP reform proposals, but it has in fact been over 6 months since we last debated this matter. Then, as now, the discussion around the detail of the negotiations of the Common Agricultural Policy engaged all sides of the chamber as we worked towards pinpointing what the best outcomes would be for farmers and the agricultural sector in Scotland. But as dry and technical as the Common Agricultural Policy can be, it does underpin a number of issues which are of fundamental importance to Scotland's future, namely the production and sustainability of our food and drink supply here in Scotland, along with the need to protect the environment for future generations and to maximise the opportunities flowing from all of these things in the context of sustainable economic development and the climate change challenge. And these points were put to me once again by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust when we met last week. The reality is that we do need modern agriculture and increased productivity from our farms to meet the demands of feeding our population. However, without due care and attention, large-scale farming can lack the biodiversity we need to support wildlife, water conservation and indeed carbon storage, as the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust has pointed out. This Parliament has also previously considered such matters of biodiversity when we took the time to discuss the 2020 challenge document sometime before the summer recess. So I hope that the same attention is paid to these issues as the Scottish Government begins to implement the finer points of the CAP agreement in the future. A few weeks ago, the Rural Affairs Committee took evidence from the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Environment, Richard Lochhead, on a number of issues, including CAP reform. In his opening evidence to the committee, the Minister was able to highlight some of the potential issues for farmers around the changes to Pillar 1 payments, and he's revisited that topic today. We're talking about reforms of complex subsidies, and the Minister has highlighted the concerns of farmers from the beef sector about the move from historic payments to area payments and the potential that they may miss out from future changes. Conversely, however, such a move to area payments under the new process would seem to be good for farmers who have previously been sidelined from single farm payments, such as deer farmers. I know that members from across the chamber have assiduously pursued the case for these farmers in the past. Previously, we had expressed concern that the changes to Pillar 1 payments coming into force in 2015 would leave some farmers in limbo for the year in between, so it's good to have confirmation that 2014 will be a transitional year before the changes come into play. The Labour amendment before us today recognises the extremely tight timescale for the introduction of the new payment systems, especially for Pillar 1. So it's obviously important that the changes which will come into force are clearly explained to all members of the farming communities and beyond, so that we know where we stand. There will always be tensions between different sections of the same industry when competing for support or funding, but I recognise some of the concerns which have been raised by many bodies, including the National Sheep Association Scotland, about the uncertainty of the changeover from single farm payments to area payments. I would be grateful if, in closing, the Minister could address concerns from hill farmers about potentially huge disparities in payments between lowland arable farms and hill farms and crofts under the switch to area payments. I also look forward to seeing how the Scottish Government will support the new greening requirements being placed upon farmers, which is such an integral part of the reforms as we go forward, given that 30% of the allocation under Pillar 1 payments are to be spent on practices which support environmental improvements. It's interesting to note, but perhaps not surprising, that all of the amendments in front of us today, although varying slightly in form and content, seek to revise a section of the motion which makes assumptions about the money which Scotland would have been able to qualify for had it been an independent member state. We are, of course, used to the Scottish Government telling us that the grass will be greener on the other side of the independence referendum, but it seems an unnecessarily speculative detail in this debate and too dependent on the unresolved question of what would happen to Scotland's EU membership in a post-independence situation. As I said back in March, it's difficult for farmers to receive direct payments from the European Commission when your government is still negotiating your accession terms, so I prefer to fix our focus on the realities of the system we are in. In drawing to a close then, I'm pleased that we're in the final stages of the CAP discussions, and as before, I hope that we are able, as the Labour amendment suggests, to approach the implementation of the new agreement fairly while maintaining a mature dialogue on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Nigel Dawn to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to start by looking at the Scottish Government's objectives in the CAP process. As the Cabinet Secretary has already alluded to, these are to continue to support active and productive agriculture so that we can continue to produce food, which I think we would all sign on for, and we can meet our environmental obligations, which I would think we would also regard as the absolute minimum, because the more we can do to improve our environment, then surely the better for all of us who live here, but more particularly the better for all those who live in rural environments and for tourism and the other industries that depend on that. The negotiating stance, as again the Cabinet Secretary has already alluded to, has been about flexibility so that Scotland can provide a fairer distribution of the money that comes here, to end slipper farming, to allow new entrants to get money earlier, and to, as far as possible, protect coupled support for livestock for the reasons already mentioned. But what would also have been nice would have been to be able to negotiate a fair share of the European pot for Scotland. And I want to take this head on, hopefully in terms that will not raise too many hackles. Angus Fergusson rightly pointed out early on that we really should be talking about what we can do with this flexibility and how it can be used wisely. Can I say that I have no doubt the Cabinet Secretary and his staff will endeavour to do so. And I have no doubt that the consultation which they will be going through will enable them to get the view of those who are involved. And I have no doubt that they will implement that as best they can. What I'd like to reflect on at the moment, Presiding Officer, is the process we have just been through, and to reflect on what might have been slightly different. Of course, the distribution of what we now have matters, but so does the total. And the total amount of money that comes into the Scottish economy, actually, one way or another, is money in the Scottish economy. But let me go back to the environment, the political environment in which we're currently operating. As a region, the United Kingdom has 6 MEPs. Were we an independent member state, like Denmark, for example, comparable size, we might have 13 MEPs. Does that matter? Well, yes, it does, because they would be on committees, they would be able to talk to people, they would actually exercise an influence as MEPs do. We would be in a better place. As members are very well aware, we would of course have a seat on the council table, and we would have periodically the opportunity for the presidency, which means we'd be setting the agenda. Seems to me that's actually very important. Now, let me compare that with the United Kingdom's stated objectives, because the Right Honourable Owen Paterson MP did come and talk to the Rural Affairs Committee. And what he said, apart from the other things which have already been quoted, is that his objective was to grow the rural economy and to improve the environment. Clearly, that's exactly the same kind of idea as the Scottish Government. We don't fall out at that point. He's not, as has already been commented on by Graham Day, perhaps, and others, and perhaps others rather, he's not so keen on Pillar 1 direct payments. But if I may quote him on Pillar 2 payments, and this is the 12th of June at 2386, Owen Paterson says, "I am an enthusiast for the benefits that our Pillar 2 schemes bring. I think we can look the British taxpayer in the eye and say that we are bringing them environmental benefits that would not normally be provided through a market mechanism and which have real value." I think we can say, all of us say aye to that, Tory or otherwise. So there is a clear benefit in even Owen Paterson's economy for Pillar 2 payments. There is a clear benefit for money going into the rural economy. Why then was it that he did not join those other 16 countries in getting an uplift to the Pillar 2 payment? I do not know the answer, but as I look to paragraph 72, this is UCO 3713, Brussels, the 8th of February, I find that among those 16 countries, the Cabinet Secretary has already referred to some of them, I won't do the entire list, Presiding Officer, though it is tempting, I find big nations. I find France negotiating 1,000 million, Italy 1,500 million, and Spain 500 million. So there's certainly no difficulty in being a big country and doing some negotiating, but apparently the UK didn't think it was a good idea to bring more money into the UK, never mind into Scotland. I find that astonishing. What I can say is, I think I'm echoing Angus MacDonald here, if that's the UK's approach, then the faster we're independent, quite honestly, the better. But the other point that has already been made is that as a member state, any other member state would, by 2020, have got that uplift to €196 per hectare in direct payments. Now, we've already heard that's worth something like £1 billion over the period between 2015 and 2020. And assuming, Presiding Officer, my mathematics is half decent, I think that's about £140 million per year. And I'll leave you with this statistic, which is that if, as current figures suggest, there are about 68,000 people working in the Scottish agriculture, it's not the number of farms, it's the number of people working in that agricultural sector. If I can round that up to 70,000 and the other figure is rounded to 140, then elementary arithmetic tells me that that is worth £2,000 for every person in the industry in Scotland every year. Now, that's money we don't seem to have got, and I think we should have had. If I might briefly address the point from Claire Baker and Jane Baxter about the apparent uncertainties of the European Union, could I make the point to them that they and I are European citizens? That European citizenship is not going to go away by constitutional change within the UK. Yes, there is clearly an element of negotiation to go on, but we are not new entrants to the European Union. That is a complete myth, and the sooner people stop peddling it, frankly, Presiding Officer, the better.
Many thanks. I now call Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Alison Johnston.
Presiding Officer, I'm glad to have the opportunity of speaking in this debate, as farming remains an important and indeed a crucial part of the economy of the Highlands and Islands. In many of our most isolated and remote communities, it's often still the only mainstay of the local economy. But it's not just important for economic reasons. In many ways, farming has defined and shaped rural life, and it's deeply embedded in our culture. But most importantly, our farmers have been the custodians of our landscapes for thousands of years now, shaping and maintaining it for all of us to enjoy. We've recently been having a debate in this Parliament about wild land. Interestingly, a few months ago, I asked Andrew Thinn of SNH to tell me where this wild land was, because despite knowing the Highlands and Islands well, I'm unaware of any land that's not been worked over in some way by the hand of man over the last 10,000 years or so. And his reply suggested that what I suspected was correct. There is no wild land in Scotland. The vast majority of our land is fully tamed and in the care of our farmers. Actually, though, there are a few isolated and desolate spots that I know that are uncared for. They're inhospitable and desperate places of impenetrable undergrowth or impassable bogs, which are virtually impossible to traverse. And anyone who knows much about our history will understand that you don't have to go far back to a time when much more of our countryside was like this. It's thanks only to our farmers that it's been tamed into something which now looks good on postcards and offers opportunities for recreation. And anyone who has doubts about this has only to consider the rampant and unfettered growth of trees and undergrowth along many of our rural roadsides which sprung up in recent years. And across much of the Highlands, many of our best views and vistas are screened behind this untrammelled growth, which is ironically much worse when tourists are about in summer and the undergrowth is on leaf. I see Mr McGregor nodding. He'll know exactly what I mean. And the once scenic railway journey from Glasgow to Oban now predominantly offers views of the rampant growth of willows and birch. And as sheep numbers decline, so we've seen in some areas an explosion of bracken, a noxious weed that cannot be controlled unless there is an economic reason for doing so. This is what happens when land is not cared for, and this is part of what is threatened if our farmers are not supported. The difficulty that our farming industry has faced in recent years is perhaps most accurately expressed in the high levels of suicide amongst our farmers, and few rural communities will not have been touched by the dreadful spectre of suicide and all that it entails. There is no doubt, Presiding Officer, that we need to support our farmers, and there is no doubt too that farmers in Scotland face many challenges undreamt of by the UK Government that purports to represent them. Thanks to the remarkable energy of the Cabinet Secretary, our farmers at least have a partial voice in Europe. Thanks to our Cabinet Secretary, we now have a very successful food and drink strategy that significantly adds value to our farmers' produce and to our rural economies. And thanks to our Cabinet Secretary, we now know that Scotland's farmers would be much better off if we were independent within Europe, with subsidies between 2050 and 2020 worth over €1 billion more than if we continue as part of the UK. The supporting arithmetic for this calculation is straightforward and compelling. We in Scotland understand our farming industry and what it requires to make it thrive, so that our farmers can continue to play their part as the backbone of our rural economies and as the custodians of our landscapes. This accords well with that self-evident principle that decisions are best taken by those who understand them, those who are closest to them, and that all decisions about Scotland are best taken here in this Parliament with proper representation in Europe and the full powers of independence.
Thank you. And I now call Alison Johnston to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland gets a bad deal from the Common Agricultural Programme. Many members have already expressed frustration at this, and I share their concerns. It is patently unfair for Scotland to receive such low funds relative to others in Europe. Relative to others in the UK, we also receive less. Scotland's high percentage of rough grazing is part of the reason. CAP subsidy is geared towards the farms which already have the best chance of being profitable. If the cap continues to reward those on the best land, Scotland will continue to lose out. Scotland, by contrast, is in an excellent position to argue that subsidy should be delivering profitable farms in tandem with the marginal and most biodiverse land. This is a big shift, away from the argument for ever more direct payments and towards a cap that delivers subsidy based on public good. I'm pleased to say that the Scottish Government follows much of the argument I've just made. Area-based payments and the eradication of slipper farming are clearly sensible moves. The continuing modulation from Pillar 1 to 2 allows more targeted support and will deliver more public good for the public subsidy. At the European level too, the principle has finally been established that Pillar 1 subsidy should be dependent on outcomes that benefit the public good. Green colleagues in Europe described the reform as a massive missed opportunity that failed to deliver a fairer distribution of funds and would not deliver all that it might for the environment. 30% of Pillar 1 will be tied to greening, but the measures are modest. They mean most farms in Scotland will not actually have to do anything additional. It was important to make sure a one-size-fits-all approach to greening did not hit Scotland's diverse sector, but biodiversity is in critical decline, and cap greening measures should be one tool to help reverse the trend. Scotland will be allowed to use 8% in coupled payments, but I agree with the Government here that there should be more scope to do more. Coupled payments could also be tied more closely with agri-environmental outcomes. The lack of a real cap on large payments, however, means funds are not available to help smaller farms and new entrants. Despite support, they will continue to find it hard to break through and make a success of new enterprises. I mentioned earlier Scotland's large percentage of rough grazing, and I want to link back to that and to talk about crofting. There's no crofting in the region that I represent in Lothian, but colleagues in the Independent Green Group have asked me to speak on this issue. Crofting is extremely important to the Highlands, where it maintains the communities in our most remote areas. The Crofters Conference held in Stornoway last month highlighted the plight of common grazing, rough grazing land that extends to 500,000 hectares. Many people feel common grazings are ignored by the cap and they are underused or being abandoned in many areas because the support available to livestock producers is too small. It is important more attention is paid to common grazings and to crofting in general. Managed grazing can promote biodiversity, can maintain the peatlands and enhance the land's high nature value, as well as providing profitable, high-quality livestock. The move to area-based payments is an opportunity to make sure rough grazing, high nature value farming and extensive livestock production are supported because they are vulnerable, but they're environmentally very important. A significant Pillar 1 move to supporting farms on more marginal land leaves open another opportunity to use funds allocated to least favoured areas to support more spending on agri-environment and organic measures. And I'd urge the Government to look at this. I support Environment Link in their calls for 50% of the SRDP fund to be allocated to agri-environment, organic and forestry. A move in Pillar 1 to more marginal land support would allow this to happen. Presiding Officer, Scotland has great potential to produce more diverse, local and organic food. And while we continue, rightly, to campaign for improvements in CAP, we must continue to do all that we can under the current arrangement to encourage and increase such production, as the benefits it brings to local communities and local economies are significant. In closing, Presiding Officer, I thank Scottish Environment Link for their briefing and their calls to ensure that the move to regionalised payments improves the level of basic payment support to high nature value farming and extensive livestock production, which is economically vulnerable, but as I've said, environmentally so important, and to improve the prioritisation and targeting of the SRDP, as well as allocating increased funding for advice. It is the case that this evening here in Parliament we may not vote as one, but I'm absolutely certain that we all in the Chamber recognise the need for a sustainable future for our rural communities, our world-renowned countryside and our environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Claire Adamson to be followed by Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was born in the same decade as the inception of CAP, and with that old Benjamin Franklin quote about there's nothing surer than death and taxes, I feel that perhaps there's nothing surer than death and taxes and calls for CAP reform. So I suppose we should put on record today that we are thankful that an agreement was reached in June of this year. But the question we should be asking is that agreement the best we can do for our farmers? Claire Baker was very right to commend farmers in her opening speech, and continuing the theme of my colleague Mike Mackenzie, I would like to talk about farmers and how they mean to this, because this is a technical debate. It's an issue, a very complicated piece of European policy filled with Pillar 1, Pillar 2 jargon and alluding to slipper farmers and sulphur farmers, and it would be very easy to become detached from the issue. But I want to talk about the humanity of farmers, and twice this week I have been reminded of that. At Scots Language Association event, I had the absolute pleasure of hearing a great young folk talent, Kirsty Law, singing one of her own compositions, in which she told the story of the horrendous impact that the winter had played on hill farmers and shepherds and our crofters. It vividly took me back to the heartrending news reports of broken-hearted farmers and crofters who were losing their livestock. And I fully concur with her message in that song, that we, people like me who live and work in sanitised, centrally heated homes and offices, can have no understanding of the hardship and rigour of farming life during weather extremes, floods and disasters. And yesterday evening, I chaired the cross-party group on accident prevention and safety awareness. And during one of the excellent presentations on accident statistics, Alec McNabb of the Health and Safety Executive, while highlighting improving trends in work-related accidents and deaths, reminded us that the agriculture sector is still where the highest incidence of deaths and accidental injuries occur in Scotland, 8 deaths per 100,000 workers in this industry. And it is a sector that's proving most difficult to deal with this issue, and that's something that we have to improve upon so that we can make substantial measurable improvements. But that also hides the fact that many children of farmers and farm workers have also live and work in these challenging environments. It is their homes. And all too often we've heard of tragic accidents of children in farm environments. And it's a huge price that farmers and their families pay for us every day of their lives. So we should hold our farmers who live and work in this sector at their hearts as we ask that question, is this the best we can do for our farmers? And if I could quote the Cabinet Secretary from his address to the Royal Highland Show this year, he said that to retain active agriculture, keep our land productive, maintain food production, safeguard the environment, remain competitive and maintain populations living in our rural communities, the settled view of Scotland is that we need ongoing support from Europe, and I absolutely agree with him in this area. And it was really good to hear that his priorities of the new entries into this area, stopping the decline, removing red tape from the process and reducing the number of slipper farmers had by and large been achieved in some of the Pillar 1 areas. And also, if I could talk about one of the partial successes in terms of coupled support, which will be 8% for member states with previously low coupled support, that he again in his address said that to reverse decline in livestock numbers, keep cattle and sheep in our hills, protect the red meat supply chain, and to produce for the domestic and export markets, Scotland wants the option of coupled support. So we should welcome that partial welcome of it, but as Alison Johnson has said, it's just simply not good enough. But many of my colleagues have talked about the potential of independence and what that could mean if Scotland was a member state. Angus MacDonald listed how badly we were performing compared to some of the member states, and 16 other countries, Scotland not included, have managed to negotiate an uplift. I would like to talk about research and development funding in Europe, which is structural funding. And this is another area we're constantly being told we're stronger in the UK, but where the UK leads at the moment, Scotland follows by and large because of the Barnett formula. UK spends 1.7% of GDP on research and development. Research and development is absolutely crucially important in all the areas Jane Baxter mentioned: biodiversity, carbon capture, animal husbandry. We could go on and on about how diversity and innovation is so important in this area. But the European target for research per GDP is 3%. We are hugely underperforming in this area. And if we look at some of our Nordic countries, which we often compare ourselves to, but Sweden spends 3.4% of its GDP on research and development. So it's not just what happens within the CAP funding, it's everything in Europe where we are underperforming that we could do so much better as an independent Scotland. And Jane Baxter kind of said that she was living in the real world. But I go back to the Cabinet Secretary address again, where he said at the Royal Highlands show, many businesses tell me that the biggest threat to our food and drink industry is indeed the forthcoming referendum. Not the one in 2014, but the UK's proposed referendum on EU membership in 2017. So I ask again, is this the best we can do for our farmers? I think not. Independents could do so much more.
Many thanks. I now call on Elaine Murray to be followed by Roderick Campbell. There is some time in hand to allow for interventions.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, some people, nobody I imagine within this room, might think that the CAP is of peripheral interest, but I was struck by the statistic that 77% of the European Union land mass is defined as rural, 47% of that is farmland and 30% of that is forest, and also that half of the European Union's population lives in these rural areas. So CAP may involve huge sums of money, but either directly or indirectly, it affects a large proportion of Europe's residents. The European Parliament, Commissioners and Council of Ministers announced agreement on reforming of the CAP post-2013 on the 26th of June this year. And according to the Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development at the time, the reformed CAP will, quote, make direct payments fairer and greener, strengthen the position of farmers within the food production chain and make CAP more efficient and more transparent. Now, let's hope that that will indeed be the case, and I think there are aspects, as many members have already mentioned, which are welcome. However, experience of the previous CAP and indeed common fisheries policies suggests that judgment won't be able to be made until we actually see how it works out in practice. The two pillars of support, direct support and rural development, will remain, despite earlier suggestions that direct support should be discontinued. And again, I think we all in this chamber welcome that. No single member state will receive less than 75% of the EU average by 2019, and subsidies will be levelled by subsidising acreage farmed rather than production. Member states will be able to offer further help, as the Cabinet Secretary already informed us, to help to small and medium-sized farms by allocating higher levels of subsidy to first hectares of a holding. No farm will receive less than 60% of the EU average subsidy dispersed by 2019 in a single administrative area. And unlike the current system of subsidy, which was based on land area and past subsidy levels, the new income support regime will be available only to active farmers. I think we all think that's a very welcome development. The suggestion being that certain landowners engage in other non-farming, prescribed non-farming activities should be excluded. I think there is a problem there, that there are the potential for loopholes, and I share the concerns that have already been expressed by others that needs to be tightened up. And we've also heard that measures can be taken to encourage young farmers to set up in business with a 25% aid supplement for the first 5 years. I also welcome the fact that 30% of direct payments will have to be linked to environmentally friendly farming practices, such as crop diversification and the maintenance of permanent pasture, and with 5% increasing to 7% of land to be fallow to encourage wildlife and biodiversity, or to be subject to measures delivering similar environmental benefits. However, with those who are involved in active farming, and both David Stewart and Graham Day have already referred to this in the debate today, for many of Scotland's rural communities, the development and implementation of the Scottish Rural Development Programme will probably be of greater impact, and it is also on that which I intend to focus my contribution. 30% of the Rural Development Programme will also have to be allocated to agri-environmental measures, and these measures will also have to set and meet higher environmental protection targets. But the Cabinet Secretary will be aware that at COSLA's Convention on the 28th of June 2013, the Convention agreed that local government should be allocated at least 1/3 of the 2014 to 2020 EU funds, in order that councils could better decide how these funds might be prioritised for the benefit of their rural communities. Now, I know some people may dismiss that as being, COSLA always asking for more money, but I think there is actually a genuine case that can be built around that particular argument. The reasoning behind this request from COSLA is that rural areas will be particularly impacted by a reduction in CAP direct payments. Local authorities believe that one of the best ways to mitigate the effects of this reduction would be to ensure that the SRDP has sufficient flexibility to support economic and social programmes designed to address the needs and priorities of specific regions. Local communities in previous years have had very limited access to rural and maritime programmes, which constitute 50% of EU funding in Scotland. The current discussions offer an opportunity to reassess how spend could be reprofiled to address the development and diversification needs and priorities in individual local authority areas and their rural and coastal communities. Structural and rural and maritime funding could complement each other in supporting activities such as community-led development, tackling deprivation, skills and training needs in rural communities, business support and other locally focused programmes. The EU specifies a 5% minimum threshold for the Leader initiative. However, governments can choose to allocate a higher percentage, and I am told that there is also €30 million of SRDP monies not yet allocated, which could be used to expand Leader or to support rural business development through Business Gateway. Local authorities argue that if too much EU funding is channelled through national agencies, the result will be uniform and inflexible arrangements which are not able to address the specific needs of different and diverse rural and coastal communities. Devolution to local authorities, they argue, would deliver more tailored solutions and would also complement the Scottish Government's own community the community planning approach, and also would be in accordance with the Scottish Government's own approach to its partnership agreements with local authorities. I understand that early meetings are to be sought between COSLA spokespeople and the relevant Cabinet Secretaries, Mr Lochhead himself, Ms Sturgeon and Mr Swinney. So I would actually be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary, or indeed the Minister, I don't know which is summing up this evening, might advise whether any such meetings have been arranged with respect to the Scottish Rural Development Programme, and also what consideration is being given to a greater devolution of responsibility for administering the SRDP at a local authority level. Now, obviously, that would have to be within EU rules, but it does offer, it is argued, a more focused approach to addressing the needs of our rural and coastal communities, which are very different from Dumfries and Galloway up to the north of Scotland. We have a diverse and divergent rural communities which have different needs, and it is, I think, local people who could probably address those needs best rather than large national organisations or large national agencies which maybe do not actually reflect the needs of particular areas. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Roderick Campbell to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For those of us of a certain age, early debates about the common market were often bedevilled with discussions about the common agricultural policy and its inadequacies, and the fact that the policy was designed to benefit poor peasant French farmers and not efficient British farmers was the frequent claim. Well, in this afternoon's debate, I've not heard much about this. The Eurosceptics on the right of politics today seem primarily concerned with the threat to the City of London from financial regulation and from Frankfurt itself. But in reality, as we all know, the CAP still swallows up a substantial part of the EU budget, and therefore it remains a very important issue in the European debate. We know, of course, of the Cabinet Secretary's concerns that while he has had a reasonably high profile in matters of fishing at a European level, in relation to agriculture, his position has been significantly weaker. When Owen Paterson gave evidence to our own Rural Affairs Committee in June, he defended that position. With due respect to Mr Paterson, I think I can do no better than to quote from the official report. Mr Paterson said, quote, "Fishing is a bit different because the interests of all four parts of the UK are similar. In agriculture, all four parts are a bit different. Also, the agricultural issues are quite contentious. Without being brutal, the sheer physical circumstances of a bilateral mean that we are talking to the French or Germans in their languages. We do not have very long. There is not time to go into translation, and I get more done by talking to them direct and then reporting back as I do with Richard Lochhead. If he is there, we have a meeting back in the office of the United Kingdom Permanent Representation to the European Union, and I will tell him what has happened. All the ministers are very busy, and there is not time to go into translations with some of them. We have to crack on, have a direct conversation with them, and then come back. You must not underestimate the trouble to which I go to keep Richard Lochhead informed. Those were his words. Well, those words say it all, I think, about the approach adopted. Not so much active participation, more, dare I say it, a slightly patronising approach to sharing information. Certainly not active engagement with Scotland's Cabinet Secretary. While I'm aware that Owen Paterson was generally considered to have had a not unsuccessful time in his previous job as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I'm not sure he has displayed that talent in dealing with Scotland in his current portfolio. Indeed, yeah.
Thank you very much for taking such an intervention. If Owen Paterson was so neglectful of the needs of Scotland, why was he happy to negotiate 8% coupled payment when he himself would prefer not to have any coupled payment at all?
I don't think I'd say he was completely neglectful. It's just it's in the approach he's adopting, in the style. Of course, agriculture remains of vital importance to Scotland, and changes to the CAP need to be properly addressed. Getting CAP reform right is important to the continued success of Scotland's food and drink industry. While others have drawn attention to the substantial difference independence would make to Pillar 1, I want to look principally at Pillar 2. In relation to rural development funding in Scotland, for the last 7 years, we've received approximately €360 million, about €9 per hectare per year, as against 15 per hectare for the UK as a whole. And we are right at the bottom of the European League, as others have suggested, receiving much less than the Czech Republic, Denmark and Ireland. I accept, of course, there may be historical reasons for this, i.e. when the first EU multi-year rural development programme was worked out for 2000 to 2006, national allocations of spending were based on what national governments were spending at the time, which was very little in the case of the UK, especially very little on agriculture, environment schemes and rural development. And secondly, it's also true, of course, that in order not to impact on the UK rebate, the UK has traditionally been keen on voluntary modulation from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. So whilst Mr Paterson was keen to tell this Parliament in June that the figures were settled and how they were carved up was a matter for the Scottish ministers, including the geographical areas they're distributed in, with all due respect, if the pot isn't big enough in the first place, some of these choices may prove not to be real choices. And given the extent of less favoured areas in Scotland, how much flexibility is there in that choice anyway? It's to our great advantage, I think, that the UK failed to negotiate a special uplift or fairer share for Scotland. As to the negotiations on a transfer from Pillar 2 to Pillar 1, which now leads or potentially lead the UK to have the potential to have a 25% transfer, whatever success that was for the UK, and I accept that Owen Paterson doesn't favour such transfers in any event, it's hard to see that being a benefit to Scotland, indeed quite the reverse. We know, of course, as Rob Gibson has said, that 16 member states use the need for unanimous agreement to negotiate top-up funds for Pillar 2, and if it's good enough for Slovenia and Ireland, it's good enough for Scotland. In relation to transition agreements, whilst I welcome the extension of agriculture environment contracts and the position in relation to forestry payments, and indeed the extension of the less favoured area support scheme, they do not detract from the big picture that an independent Scotland could have done better. I'm less than clear, however, about where we are with Leader. I accept the Scottish Government has an important role in negotiations itself, and like many MSPs, I hear criticism of the bureaucracy of this programme, some of which criticisms may lie here in Scotland. It does, of course, represent, however, a very small part of the overall budget for Pillar 2, and should not detract from the overall argument that Scotland's best interests lie in having its own seat at the top table. In conclusion, our opponents take great delight in talking of the uncertainties of independence, while failing to acknowledge the certainty that in this area an independent could do so much better. An independent Scotland could do so much better, let alone the uncertainties of the in-out referendum by 2017. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
And thank you. I now call on Dennis Robertson, after which we'll move to the closing speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have a great deal of admiration for the Cabinet Secretary, and again other members in this chamber, Presiding Officer, who understand the complexities around CAP. I have a great deal of sympathy for our farmers and their families who probably went into farming to raise a livelihood, not to understand the complexities and the red tape that's foisted upon them with regard to CAP. Now, I know that some of our probably wealthier farmers can employ accountants and farm managers to look after that side of the business. But for many of our farmers, Presiding Officer, they've got to come to terms, and it's the outcomes. At the end of the day, our farming community want to know what is going to be there for them at the end of the day to ensure that they can continue to farming, to ensure that they can continue to help in the production of our food and drink industry. Presiding Officer, I am fortunate to be in a constituency that is quite diverse, and it certainly has a great deal of farming within it. I've heard from farmers asking basically, is it right that decisions are made in Europe in the small hours of a morning when probably the last thing on their mind is maybe making the best outcomes for sort of farmers, but maybe thinking about when can I get out of the chamber and actually get to my bed. I think maybe when we're looking at the review of CAP in the future, perhaps we should be looking at the way that the negotiations take place at Brussels and try and ensure that when the member states are looking at the best way forward for our farming industry in the future, they're doing it at a time that would actually be much more productive for our farmers at the end of the day. I was smiling somewhat when Rod Campbell was reading from the official report on Owen Patterson. And I was starting to feel a little sorry for him, Presiding Officer. I really feel sorry for him, given that he was working so hard and that he was so busy. But within that schedule, he managed to find just a little time to inform, or was it to tell, in fact, our Cabinet Secretary of what was actually going on. I wonder, actually, within that busy schedule, he actually found time to listen to what our Cabinet Secretary was asking in terms of a fair deal for Scotland. It would appear that members in the chamber are all, I think, supportive of a fairer deal for Scotland. And in that case, if we are supportive of a fairer deal, then perhaps we should unite behind the Cabinet Secretary at decision time this evening. Because the only way that I can see forward in terms of a fairer deal for Scotland, for our farmers in Scotland, is perhaps for Scotland to be at that top table in Europe, making the decisions within that top table, working with the other member states, not sitting outside the office of a UK secretary waiting for him to return so that we can be informed of how the negotiations are going. Presiding Officer, our food and drink industry is extremely important to Scotland, but to ensure that that production continues, and continues in the way that is for the good of the people. And I take those terms from Alison Johnson's comments earlier, the good of the people. We need to ensure that not just for the good of the people within the farming industry, but for the good of the people in the wider communities of Scotland. And that is for the good of our countryside too. We need to ensure that our farming is supported in order that we can actually ensure that our countryside, our Scotland, can actually be a better place to live in. That it has the diversity, that we actually meet our climate change targets. But to do so, we must ensure that the appropriate supports are given to those who look after our land. Mike McKenzie was giving a picture postcard aspect of Scotland in its full ruggedness and sometimes the scenic beauty. But that is Scotland, Presiding Officer. And we have what we have. And our farmers make the best of what we do have. We have our sheep farmers ensuring that we actually make the best of our rugged Scotland. We have our cattle, we have our deer, we have our crops. Our whisky industry thrives on the production of good crops within Scotland. And our exports to the rest of the world brings money back into our economy. We support a huge rural environment, communities or societies. Our rural communities are dependent upon good farming for the future. And the future of our farming, presiding officer, is dependent upon a good future for our nation. I don't believe that we have a fair deal. I don't believe that the best has been done with the CAP. I welcome the comments from Alex Fergusson, saying that he will do what he can to ensure that we get the appropriate uplift in the coupling. That's fantastic. I welcome that. But I ask myself the question, presiding officer, will Owen Paterson listen to Alex Fergusson when at the end of the day he's only prepared to tell our Cabinet Secretary the outcome from negotiations? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now move to closing speeches, and I call on Tavish Scott. 7 minutes, please.
Much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me start with the External Convergence Fund, because that has been a notable feature of today's debate. Now, it wasn't that long ago that the First Minister asked Ian Gray, Annabel Goldie and I to join with him in a delegation he led down to the Ministry of Defence, to the then Defence Secretary, on the issue of jobs at Lossiemouth. And that was a successful cross-party campaign, rightly led by the Scottish Government, and we made what I hoped and I think was subsequently discovered to be a reasonably coherent cross-party case for a change that was going to be damaging to Scottish interests, in that sense very damaging to Mr Lochhead's constituency. And not only did we do that, but all of us joined Mr Lochhead in his own patch to make that case in front of a football crowd at the stadium in Elgin. And I don't regret any of that. I thought that was a good way in which this Parliament could work. So I would make the same offer today on external convergence. I share the concerns that the Cabinet Secretary has, that Alec Fergusson has, that Claire Baker has in relation to what is happening on this issue. There is no question that the Minister's argument in relation to these funds coming to Scotland based on an equal payment share is the right argument that others have made as well. So if he wants to construct a way in which we can all come together to support that argument and indeed to make that case to the UK Government, even to the Minister who has been subject to some criticism during the course of this afternoon's proceedings, then I would certainly join him in doing that. If he thinks that would help, then please could he take it from me, and I suspect from my colleagues as well on the other front benches that we'd be delighted to play a constructive role in making the right constructive argument for that, and I hope he might take that in the spirit in which I intend it. Now, I accept that a debate on Scottish agriculture, Deputy Presiding Officer, just before a referendum on Scottish independence is bound to feature in terms of that. And we had Rob Gibson and Angus MacDonald's speeches to behold in that context. They certainly failed the test I got at the Shetland March last Saturday, which is stop talking about independence and start talking about what we need out of CAP reform. But so be it. If that is how colleagues in other parties, or particularly on the nationalist benches, wish to conduct their affairs, that of course is absolutely their right. All I would say to Nigel Donn on EU negotiations is he is right that it is not a matter of whether Scotland could be independent and be a member of the European Union. It is about the terms of that membership. I agree with him on that point, and it is the sensible and only way to look at that particular issue. But believe me, I don't so much worry about agriculture. If you want to take the rural economy, the fishing argument is the one I worry a lot more about, because the Spanish would love a negotiation on fish with an independent Scotland. So that is so at least if on something we could possibly agree that it's certainly about the terms of negotiation rather than whether there would be a negotiation. And can I also just say on the budget, I must say it is often the case that the nationalist benches attack the rest of us for consistency on the budget. It is not consistent, I say to Roderick Campbell and to others, to go on and on and on about the budget when your own sides have had 3 positions on the EU budget during the course of the last year. Because in here you voted for an increase, in Westminster you voted for a cut, and your MEPs in Brussels voted for a freeze. So if you're going to make the consistency argument about the budget, do so having been consistent in your own voting record in different parliaments, both here and in London and in Brussels. Of course I'll give way.
It ill behoves the Lib Dems to suggest MPs, MEPs and MSPs are not singing from the same hymn sheet, given your own track record on fishing issues in Europe.
I don't even begin to understand that one, but if it makes Mr MacDonald feel better, then so be it. Can I move on, Deputy Presiding Officer, to some of the better arguments and more considered thoughts that were made in the debate this afternoon? David Stewart and others, Graham Day, made very important arguments about SRDP. Now, frankly, I don't envy the Cabinet Secretary on this one, because any assessment of what movement from budgets from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 mean makes life incredibly difficult for active agricultural producers. And yet, on the other hand, as Graham Day very eloquently described, there are really good businesses in his constituency, and no doubt right across our constituencies and regions, who have benefited from SRDP funding. Yet, all of us who have been involved in and around this industry for a long time know that direct monies into farming bank accounts then mean that that money is recycled into the rural economy, whether through payments to suppliers, to machinery shops, to fertiliser providers, or just to the local shop for the cornflakes for the kids. That is the way in which the rural economy genuinely moves and is sustainable, and is the case for both rural and island areas. And that is the, frankly, horrible dilemma, and I genuinely mean that in a positive spirit to Mr Lochhead, a horrible dilemma that he has in terms of getting that right. The only other observation I'd make is that he, I guess, does have some choices around, for example, forestry, which again I think Graham Day rightly mentioned, because there the Scottish Government, in a Scottish policy decision, have made a very big commitment to cover 25% of productive Scottish land with trees by planting 10,000 hectares a year for the next 10 years. If I've got my numbers wrong, I apologise. But the principle there is a very big commitment indeed. Now, that is coming from the SRDP budget. That is a big and significant financial commitment. The only observation I'd make is it would be for the Minister to decide whether that's the right priority in meeting what he rightly describes as his climate change targets through that particular measure, as opposed to taking other routes. Can I also just briefly... Yes, of course.
Ms Robertson.
I thank the member for taking a quick intervention at the point. The member acknowledged that the Cabinet Secretary has also negotiated with the farmers that there will be no tree planting on any arable land, that it is land that is probably best designated for tree planting.
I completely accept that's a very that is my understanding of it as well. But I'm sure Mr Robertson would agree that the target remains, and therefore that land has to come from somewhere in order for that target to be met. Let me finish with a couple of other minor points. I thought Mike Mackenzie made a very good point about crofting and about, as Alison Johnson did as well, about scattles, and that was at the heart of the point I was trying to make around the million sheep breeding animals we have lost from Scottish agriculture in the last decade. That is not, I would hasten to add, not under one government. It's happened under a number of governments and happened under different cap regimes. And the fact that I can now walk a large chunk of the Shetland scattles and see not any active livestock and any active production at all suggests to me that there are some really fundamental questions. And in that, I don't believe that a one-size-fits-all policy in relation to either area payment rates or into the detail of what happens can be appropriate given Scotland's geography. And the challenge, therefore, for the Cabinet Secretary is recognising, even in the Highland area, that the Black Isle is very different from Wester Ross, and the system has to, in some way, deal with that.
Many thanks. I now call on Jamie McGregor, 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I refer to my agricultural interests in the Register of Members' Interests. Alex Fergusson, in an excellent speech, set out our general approach to the reform package, and I want to pick up on some of these themes and others of particular relevance to farmers and crofters, especially in my region of Highlands and Islands. Now, Dennis Robertson, I thought, also made an excellent speech. He spoke of outcomes and about people, and I agree with him. That's what all this is about. Because crofters and farmers all over Scotland are holding their breaths and crossing their fingers. And as an MSP for Highlands and Islands, I must emphasise the need to regenerate hill farming in the remote areas. Masses of jargon has emanated from Europe lately, but sadly you cannot feed cattle and sheep on jargon. More of the money should go uphill, as is the EU intention. But EU payments used to be entitled the Hill Livestock Compensatory Allowance, but that is that the payments now are dreadfully inadequate to tackle the fall in numbers of livestock in the Highlands and Islands, which leads to a fall in the number of farming families and depopulation. An Argyll farming constituent pointed out there used to be a solid week of cattle sales in Oban in October. Now there is one day, and it's often over by early afternoon. And it's the same in the sheep sector. Despite an improvement in prices last year, it's just very vulnerable because many think that the job is just not worth the effort. And although the subsidies seem very big, they are very quickly used up in repairs of building, maintenance of fencing, drainage, fertilizers, which of course can't be targeted because these would be production subsidies. Unlike in the late 60s and 70s, when farmers got 90% grant for drainage, 70% for spreading lime on the hills, plus 50% grants for fencing. And a good mixed farm now can take in some £350 per acre, while a Highland Hill farm is lucky to take in 35. And a hill farm has to buy in most of its winter feed and usually has to outwinter its ewe lambs elsewhere away from home, which costs at least £15 a head, which is very expensive but necessary for quality stock in the future. Now, hill farmers, I want to make this point, with hefty breeding stocks are forced to keep their young breeding stock all the year round for replacements. They can't just buy them and sell them as a commodity. Therefore, I'd like the Minister to seriously consider the addition of ewe lambs for breeding stock to the number used for calculating stocking density, as they are just as much of a part of the picture to a hill farm as the breeding ewe is. And with the current wish for rural areas to support public good, there's no doubt that a well-managed hill farm produces tremendous biodiversity and access to the public for walking and other sports and recreations, a point which I thought Mike Mackenzie made exceptionally well. Now, when I myself started having an interest in farming in the Highlands in the early 70s, in fact in the late 70s it was, the primary industries of agriculture, forestry and fisheries provided very significant employment. This, unfortunately, is no longer the case, and I'd like to see that situation reversed. Apparently, that's the EU intention. We're told it is. But now, most family farms no longer employ a shepherd or cattleman, and most of the villages built for forestry workers no longer house them. Over 100 families were employed on Loch Orside, where I live, in connection with the Forestry Commission. That's gone. Despite the EU subsidies, employment in the primary industries of farming, forestry and fisheries has fallen. Now, I accept the reality of the move to an area-based system of direct payment, but I agree very much with the comments of the NFUS that how Scotland is mapped is going to be crucial. The effects are crucial. Both 3- and 2-region models should be assessed. Accurate mapping is of particular importance to those farming in our hills, glens and islands, where small areas of productive land must be captured by the mapping system to ensure payments adequately reflect those areas. I'm insistent that this system should deliver more money up the hill, where the seed corn of the sheep industry is bred, and where the agricultural employment should be much higher than as it used to be. And I'm very aware of the concerns of some producers in my region, for example, Orkney beef producers, and those with breeding hill flocks and farmers of the more productive areas of the islands, like Isla, who voiced their concerns to me when I met some of them last week, who fear they will be losers in the new area-based system, and their anxieties should be addressed. If we have an area-based system, the move must not be too dramatic or fast as to throw current farming systems into chaos or insolvency. Farmers need time to adapt to a new system. The option to couple payments to sustain vulnerable sectors is going to be an extremely important feature of the support going forward. And as the NFUS has suggested, targeting payments to active livestock units reduces the possible flattening of area payments. But the area payments must be big enough in the hills to stop the current decline in livestock numbers. Otherwise, the present depopulation, which is particularly evident in Argyll and Bute, will just continue. On rural development funding, the challenge for government is to have a system that does not take so much money from Pillar 1 that the whole farming sector is put at a competitive disadvantage compared to other nations. We're very clear that LFAS must remain the first priority in the new SRDP, and it should bring in new entrants excluded by the 2009 base year. I'm told that the old LFAS will remain until 2017 before it becomes ANC. This payment is a sheet anchor for farmers in disadvantaged areas, and please let it remain so. What other SRDP funds are available must be channeled into rural development measures that are accessible, practical, and underpin our crofters and farmers. Too many in the past have simply been put off applying by the complexity, labour, or anticipated time required, or believe that the options are not appropriate for small-scale producers. As my friend John Scott said recently at the cross-party group on rural policy, Scottish food and drink has never been more popular, but we need to keep producing the basic ingredients. Now, Rob Gibson made that point very well as well. If we're going to take that forward, Scotland's food and drink, it's got to be sustainable. And I know that further consultation with stakeholders will take place this autumn, and the point was made strongly to government officials at last week's crofting cross-party group, including by NFU's Argyll and the Islands Regional Manager Lucy Sumption. I'm just finishing. That stakeholders need early notice of these meetings so that views can be gathered and passed on to government.
Thank you very much. Many thanks. Now call on Claudia Beamish. 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm taken aback by how much I agree with what my Conservative colleague has just raised. What a surprise, but, you know, we are also Labour united as well as better together, so there we go. Anyway, however complex some of the intricacies of CAP reform may be, we owe it to rural Scotland to grapple with them, and this afternoon's debate has, in my view, shown the determination to get this right. Right as a way forward for farmers of all types in a sustainable way that takes into account climate change, biodiversity and land stewardship. Right as expressed by my colleague Claire Baker in the context of the significant debates ongoing about food, local accessibility of affordable food through to our proud record on exporting our produce, and right for our rural communities and businesses, and indeed right for urban Scotland, as those of us who are rural dwellers ensure that they are made welcome by us all. As highlighted by Dave Stewart, the wait for the EU agreement on CAP has been frustrating, although it has finally arrived. In his broad-ranging and historical and geographical analysis, he put forward a critique on why we need public support for agriculture, which I commend to this chamber. And Mike Mackenzie has also highlighted how farmers have been custodians of our landscape for thousands of years. Much time has been spent in recent months, though, working on the best possible interim arrangements, time that could have been spent elsewhere. However, this is where we are, and the interim arrangements highlighted today are essential. And the Scottish Government for funding support in the transition period is welcome. Could the Cabinet Secretary highlight any groups who are still at risk in this transition period? On first taking on this brief, I spoke in a CAP reform debate in January 2012. I had taken soundings from friends who were Clydesdale farmers in my region on the modelling of the basic payment options. This was a real cause for concern then, with farmers on the Clyde Valley floor, but a field away from hill farmers in the shadow of Tinto Hill, the highest of Scotland's hills. As Alex Fergusson stated, there will be winners and losers. The combination of the stakeholder group and the series of ongoing consultations have moved the arguments on a long way, and we must achieve a coherent way forward. Whether a 2 or 3 type land model is the final choice, it is essential that the budget is shared as fairly as possible. Jane Baxter has acknowledged the positive way forward to include deer farmers who have been sidelined in the past, and she also highlighted the National Sheep Association of Scotland's concerns. The arrangement must be fair to all sectors, and other members have raised other sectors in this debate. In the words of Angus MacDonald, we must also avoid a retreat from the hills. Even for Alison Johnson, as a Lothians MSP, to be mentioning the crofters shows the significance of it for all of us here today. Today's comments from Nigel Miller, President of the NFUS, must be listened to with care in this process of modelling as it moves forward. He stresses in today's Farmer, and I quote, that the fine mapping will be vital, and suggests that the IACS land use approach might be more robust and more finely tuned at the farm level, and the farm level will be essential. Decisions on CAP spending should result in benefits for the public in general, as I've already stressed. Not only the farmers who receive the funding in Pillar 1. This could be achieved by following the example of England, where the maximum modulation from Pillar 1 to 2 has indeed been agreed. These benefits could be realised through measures to increase biodiversity, such as planting for bees, or funding towards landscape and heritage projects. Though Alex Fergusson and Tavish Scott argued for less modulation, we disagree with this, although we do agree that it should be a slow and carefully monitored process. There will be further discussions before this significant decision takes place, and I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will ensure that everyone is part of that. For Pillar 2, in the words of the Cabinet Secretary, I think he said this is more of an evolution than a revolution. And Pillar 2 funding agreement at EU level enables us to move forward with the organisation of relevant schemes and enables support to be directed towards strengthening rural development, not only the agriculture sector, but the rural economies, allowing these communities to flourish. Dave Stewart put forward compelling evidence from the range of academia and the voluntary sector, calling on government policies to be tailored to meet the wider needs of rural Scotland. The wider realities of rural Scotland, and Graham Day also stressed this importance. Elaine Murray, indeed, highlighted up to a third of the amounts from the EU funds being put to COSLA, which might at first seem like an odd request for consideration, but I think the point was well made about the help with skills and training and the different diverse and rural coastal communities at the level across Scotland. So I hope the Cabinet Secretary will comment on that in his final remarks. There are so many calls from rural Scotland for support that I do wish the Cabinet Secretary well with the decisions to streamline and simplify the application process for RDP and offer our help where useful in ensuring that the process embraces the aspirations for the future of rural Scotland. That said, it is slightly disappointing in the Cabinet Secretary's press release today through the Scottish Government that it focuses almost exclusively on the agriculture sector, although I do appreciate the timescale and hope that in the closing remarks he will be making some remarks about SRDP as well. On the issue of the funding, I've been made aware of a number of applicants experiencing the difficulties in applying for funding, with many having to seek professional help in filling out forms which are indeed very complex. And could the Cabinet Secretary provide us with an update on how the application process is being simplified? Nigel Don stressed the importance of tourism. In my own region, the Centre Director of Rock UK in Newcastleton, Lee Musson, has highlighted how inflexible he found the application process. It may be that the system was designed for farmers and set with agricultural types, but is not well suited to rural development programmes for tourism in a remote area, which was for tracks and for a bridge, and had to be done field by field, which was extremely difficult for this applicant. This is just one example from my region, and no doubt there are others. I want to move now to environmental concerns and the broader aspect of CAP in this regard. The decision to reform CAP provides a great opportunity to move towards a more sustainable form of agriculture, and Scottish Environment Link, among others, have contacted me to highlight these issues which I raised today. It is my contention that there is not so much conflict as some see between these priorities and the future of Scottish farming. The blunt instrument of the greening of Pillar 1 has presented challenges for Scotland, which have been to some degree resolved and which have been worked on together through our committee and in other ways to find a resolution relative to our climate and our farmland. Scottish Wildlife Trust has called for meaningful equivalence of green measures that actually deliver environmental benefit. And as the Cabinet Secretary has stressed to Link, see, I quote, all of Scotland's farmers behaving in a greener way. There are indeed many examples of good practice in Scottish farming already, and the focus farms, such as at Tor Farm, the organic farm in my region owned by Ross Patton, that we heard of in our committee recently in the Behaviour Change Roundtable for Climate Change, is an example, and there are many others. I think it is vital that such good practice is shared widely, and I was pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary raise the issue of climate change. Link has also strongly advised that funding be put towards supporting an improved advisory service on environmental issues, which covers both Pillar 1 cross-compliance as well as encouraging actions in Pillar 2. The request for support has also been made by farmers in the region for a range of aspects of farming, not least the form filling. And could the Cabinet Secretary let us know if there will be further advisory support coming forward in the new arrangements? The mature dialogue called for in our amendment between the Scottish Government and UK governments has, frankly, been somewhat hampered by the disappointment of not seeing Owen Paterson again until next year. But leaving that aside, because I think it would have been helpful if he could have come before our committee before next year, there is, in our view... Yes, I will if I have time.
I can understand your disappointment that Owen Paterson hasn't been able to fill time in his diary to come in front of the Rural Affairs Committee and receive all the vitriol that he's had in the chamber this afternoon. I wonder if you'd like to accept and indeed agree with me that it is very good news that he is in fact in Scotland today, meeting with the National Farmers Union for Scotland, learning more about Scotland's desires and needs.
Claudia Beamish, you must close shortly, please.
I would certainly acknowledge that that's a step in the right direction, but I do think that dialogue with our committee at this very important time would have been helpful as well. I no doubt hope that he's visiting some of the Crofton communities on his journey.
You really should draw to a close.
Yes, I will.
Now.
There is a strong case for the uplift coming here, and we in Scottish Labour will work across this chamber to look with the Cabinet Secretary and other parties to try to achieve this. And within Scotland, it is vital that we all work together to ensure that we get the best deal for our farmers and our rural communities. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I'll call on the Cabinet Secretary. You have until 5 o'clock, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I should probably start off by welcoming the many expressions of sympathy for my decisions that lie ahead over the next few months. I was feeling daunted before I came into this debate, and now I feel an even greater weight on my shoulders. However, I guess the expressions of sympathy do illustrate that members from across all parties across the chamber recognise that the issues we are debating today, and I feel that we've debated well, are very important issues for the future of Scotland as a country in terms of many different sectors, and of course in particular our rural communities. Starting out the CAP reform process, I was always at pains to make it clear that I felt we had to do what we could to ensure that we had men and women in this country producing food for the nation, as well as looking after the environment and delivering other public benefits. And that's a very precious thing we have to hold on to as a country, men and women with the skills to produce food, especially in a world with a growing population and less land on which to grow food for that growing population. And that means, no doubt, in the decades ahead, as a country, we have to be more self-sufficient and more careful about food security issues as a people and as a country. So these issues are extremely important. And I think Claire Adamson, Mike McKenzie, Jane Baxter, amongst others, mentioned the importance, of course, in terms of underpinning the economic contribution of our food and drink industry to Scotland, because the raw materials produced by our farmers and crofters, of course, underpin that hugely successful industry, which was celebrating, of course, achieving its targets for growth 6 years early, just a few weeks ago during Scotland Food and Drink Fortnight. Another area I've been at great pains to highlight over the past few months, as we've negotiated with the UK and other member states in the European Union, is that we have a distinctive agriculture sector with unique issues, unique challenges, unique opportunities, unique features. And that's why we need the right policy coming through the CAP reform process for this country. If you look at our climate, if you look at the fact many of our farming communities and food producers have a great distance from their markets, if you look at the diversity of our industry with the hills, the lowland, the north, the south, the mainland, the islands, and everything else in between, clearly that means we have a very challenging policy that we have to implement that's not a one-size-fits-all, but has to deal with that diverse agriculture sector we have. And in terms of the fact that 85% of land in Scotland is less favoured area status compared to exactly the opposite situation south of the border, where it's only 15%, again highlights why we've got a unique case here for agricultural policy.
MacArthur.
The Cabinet Secretary taking an intervention. He's pinpointed one of the concerns in terms of the transfer from Belfast to areas of natural constraint. Clearly, this is a principle he's signed up for. Can he indicate what the likely coverage is going to be of areas of natural constraint? And can he, would he share my belief that islands are very clearly areas of natural constraint that would fall within the new scheme when it comes into force?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I was going to come on to the need to give certainty to our farming communities and crofting communities as soon as possible. and that's why it was so important to put the transition arrangements in place for 2014, and therefore LFAS payments will continue. And in terms of the long-term future of LFAS, we have until 2018 before areas of natural constraints comes in to replace the existing LFAS scheme. We're confident we've got most of the details right for that, but of course there's still some time between now and the new scheme comes into play. And in terms of the transition period, which many members also mentioned, yes, we are putting in place arrangements for new entrance schemes, for woodland creation, agri-environment schemes. Where we are unable to plug the gap, I think Claudia Beamish asked this question, is in terms of capital expenditure. As we know, through the SRDP in Pillar 2, the Rural Development Regulation, many capital projects are funded throughout rural Scotland, and unfortunately Europe would not listen to us and have not put in the ability to have transition for capital projects, which is a pity for the rural economy and many of the good projects. Very briefly.
Thank you for taking the intervention, Cabinet Secretary. Given the amount that has been committed to the forestry sector for 2014 to ensure ongoing plantings, is the Cabinet Secretary quite content that there is going to be enough left in the kitty to cover the agri-environmental schemes and other things that also need to be funded through the transition?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I hope we are, because quite clearly we've looked at the projected demand over the gap year itself in terms of what would have to be paid out in that calendar year, that financial year. So hopefully we'll be able to deliver that. In terms of the need for certainty for our farming and crofting communities, clearly we have to look at the big changes in the new cap compared to the existing cap we're moving from. The big change, of course, is moving from historic payments to area payments. I hope we're all united in the fact you cannot pay out payments in 2020 based on the level of activity farmers were undertaking in 2002. And therefore that would be unjustifiable and it's untenable, especially at a time when new entrants are frozen out of getting support for their genuine activity at the same time. So I'm very, very pleased we've made the fundamental breakthrough that new entrants from day one of the new cap will get onto a level playing field. That is important for attracting lifeblood and the new generations into the future of agriculture and producing that and maintaining that food producing capacity I was speaking about. We have to attract new blood into agriculture. And that's really important. And of course, making sure that there's no slipper farmers under the new Common Agricultural Policy as well. Those who've exploited the loopholes within the current cap to get large payments, even though they're not conducting much actual genuine activity in their farms. That, thankfully, will be able to make history under the new cap. And finally, we all accept, I hope, that the impact of agriculture on the environment has to be taken very, very seriously, and that's why I do welcome the Commissioner's determination to make the new Common Agricultural Policy greener than the existing policy. And as many members have raised, as I've discussed in my opening speech, we are looking at how we can use the greening measures to make sure that every single farm in Scotland, hopefully in the coming years, becomes that bit greener. Hopefully to cut their carbon emissions to help us achieve our climate change and targets as a nation, also protect biodiversity, where we know there's some significant challenges we have to address. And the SRDP, of course, plays a big role in delivering these kind of measures. But in terms of the... very briefly.
On the issue of the SRDP, when would the Cabinet Secretary expect to make a decision on the voluntary modulation between Pillar 1 and 2?
Well, as the member knows, we have to take that decision over the coming months before the end of this year, and I will be conducting a mini-consultation on that specific aspect which we have to take an early decision on. Of course, we do have concerns about the pace of change from the existing system to the new system. Many members have spoken about the impact on the beef sector. The engine room of Scottish agriculture is the beef sector to a big extent. That's not just about the beef producers on the ground, the farmers who produce fantastic beef that's world famous, but also the thousands of processing jobs, the hauliers, the people working at the marts. We have to protect these jobs, and that's why I am giving close attention to the pace of change for those beef producers, so the engine room of Scottish agriculture, as they move to the new payment regime. We have to pay very close attention to that. But of course, the budget has featured in just about every single speech in this debate. You know, my job is going to be made 10 times harder because of the very poor and scandalous deal signed up to by the UK Government when it comes to the agricultural budget. I listened to the contribution from many members. I listened to the contribution from Fergusson, for instance, and indeed Jamie McGregor, who both said in this debate that it's really important, Cabinet Secretary, we do not transfer money from Pillar 1, which is the direct payments to farms on the ground, to Pillar 2, which is the wider rural development regulation, because it's really important we protect Pillar 1, that direct support. Meanwhile, their Conservative colleague in London, who was negotiating on behalf of Scotland in Brussels, wants to scrap Pillar 1. That is sheer hypocrisy and double standards. Therefore, well, very briefly, since I named you,
given that the UK Government has committed itself to Pillar 1 until at least 2020, surely the Cabinet Secretary would admit that he's basically talking out of a hole in his head on this issue.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I just say to the member, I've had to sit opposite Mr Patterson at negotiation after negotiation with him arguing to reduce Pillar 1 direct support for Scottish agriculture and arguing the free market will deliver all and it's okay for imported food or whatever that may be. I understand from your speech you totally disagree with that. I think it's time for UDI from the Scottish Tory Party. Now, Tavish Scott, of course, then said that we should not see the debate about the future of farming through the prism of independence, but instead we should see it through the prism of what's best for farmers and crofters in Scotland. Well, quite frankly, I can't do one without the other. They're absolutely tied together. The size of the budget we get as a country will determine how we can deliver for our farmers and crofters throughout Scotland. So I think that we have people on the side of this debate today who say we should vote yes in the referendum next year. We've got other people who say we should vote no in the referendum next year. Can I just say that I've been dealing with Owen Patterson and his predecessors, for that matter, for the last few years. They've been running their no campaign for quite a few years now. It's not a new thing for the no campaign from Westminster. I asked Owen Patterson to deliver support in Europe for Scottish agriculture. He said no. I asked him to ensure that the levy paid by Scottish producers that's currently lost to the south of the border comes back to Scotland. He said no. I asked him to give Scotland a fairer rural development budget because we get the lowest in the whole of Europe, not just a poor budget, not just less than a fair share. We get the worst rural development budget, I've taken enough, thank you, in the whole of Europe. Owen Patterson said no. Of course, I also said to Owen Patterson during his negotiations, can he please make the livestock sector a priority? He gave more time to talking about a sugar plant in London than he did to Scotland's livestock sector at negotiations, and he said no. So, Presiding Officer, the best way for Scotland's farmers and crofters to deal with all this no, no, no from Westminster is next September to say yes.
That concludes the debate on the Common Agricultural question. We now move to decision time. Can we have a bit of quiet, please? We now move to decision time. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I wish to remind members that in relation to the question on this afternoon's debate, if the amendment in the name of Claire Baker is agreed, the amendments in the name of Alex Fergusson and Tavish Scott fall. The first question is amendment number 7892.3 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend motion number 7892 in the name of Richard Lochhead on the Common Agricultural Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7892.3 in the name of Claire Baker is as follows. Yes, 32. No, 61. There were 14 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. In regard to the next question, I wish to remind members that if the amendment in the name of Alex Fergusson is agreed, the amendment in the name of Tavish Scott falls. The next question then is that amendment number 7892.2 in the name of Alex Fergusson, which seeks to amend motion number 7892 in the name of Richard Lochhead on the Common Agricultural Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7892.2 in the name of Alex Fergusson is as follows. Yes, 19. No, 61. There were 27 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 7892.1 in the name of Tavish Scott, which seeks to amend motion number 7892 in the name of Richard Lochhead on the Common Agricultural Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Is the Parliament agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7892.1 in the name of Tavish Scott is as follows. Yes, 19. No, 62. There were 26 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7892 in the name of Richard Lochhead on the Common Agricultural Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 7892 in the name of Richard Lochhead is as follows. Yes, 61. No, 46. There were no abstention. The motion is therefore agreed to. That ends decision time, and I now close this meeting of the Parliament.